Доброго дня, шановні колеги, шановні учасники конференції. Розпочинаємо роботу 9-ї міжнародної конференції, присвяченої спадщині всесвітньо відомого економіста Саймона Кузнеця, Нобелевського лауреата з економіки 1971 року. Слово для відкриття конференції надається ректору Харківського національного економічного університету імені Семена Кузнеця, академіку Національної академії педагогічних наук України, доктору економічних наук, заслуженому діячу науки і техніки України, професору Володимиру Пономаренку.
Dear participants of the conference, we're starting the work of the 9th International Conference dedicated to the legacy of Simon Kuznets, the world-famous economist, the 1971 Nobel Prize winner in economics. The floor for opening the conference is given to Volodymyr Ponomarenko, rector of Simon Kuznets Kharkiv National University of Economics, full member of the National Academy of Pedagogical Sciences of Ukraine, Doctor of Economic Sciences, Professor, Honored Worker of Science and Technology of Ukraine.
Дякую. Шановні учасники конференції, міжнародна та наукова українська спільнота. Вітаю вас з відкриттям 9-ї щорічної міжнародної наукової конференції «Економічний розвиток і спадщина Семена Кузнеця», яка традиційно проходить в стінах нашого університету. Місією конференції є створення платформи для конструктивної взаємодії представників ділових, академічних, суспільних кругів задля розробки ініціатив, що сприяють співпраці та прогресу у вирішенні системних проблем людства.
Dear participants of the conference, members of the international and Ukrainian scientific community, I am pleased to welcome you at the 9th Annual International Scientific Conference on theme Economic Development and Legacy of Simon Kuznets, which is traditionally held in our university. The conference mission is to create a platform for constructive interaction between representatives of business, academic, and public circles in order to develop initiatives that promote cooperation and progress in solving systemic problems of mankind.
Кожен рік, за винятком 2022 року, року початку війни в Україні, ця конференція в межах своїх дискусійних напрямів підіймає гострі питання цивілізаційного розвитку, впливу на науково-технічного прогресу та новітніх технологій на різні галузі знань, науки, економіки та соціуму. Наша конференція надає можливості обміну думками між вченими та практиками, сприяє згуртуванню науковців перед викликами 21 століття заради розуміння, дослідження та вирішення проблем цивілізації та окремих країн.
Every year, except for 2022, the year of the beginning of the war in Ukraine, this conference, within its discussion areas, raises crucial issues of civilizational development, the impact of scientific and technological progress, and latest technology on various fields of knowledge, science, economy, and society. Our conference provides an opportunity for the exchange of ideas between scholars and practitioners, promotes the unity of scientists in the face of challenges typical of the 21st century, for understanding, research, and addressing the problems of civilization in general and each country in particular.
Сьогодні ми будемо працювати в форматі круглого столу під назвою «Глобальне співробітництво та трансформація розвитку. Виклики, перспективи, інновації». Наступні напрями дискусії. Перший – економічний розвиток у вразливому світі. Друге – вища освіта в контексті цілей стійкого розвитку, виклики та очікування. Третє – соціальна економіка та пріоритети соціального розвитку. Четверте – економічна свобода та інклюзія в цифрову епоху. Усі напрями дискусії поєднує одна єдина теза – співтовариства заради інтелектуального століття. Тобто фокуси дискусії спрямовані на обговорення ключових, глобальних та регіональних проблем, геополітичних потрясінь, стимулювання зростання та підвищення рівня життя та забезпечення справедливого та інклюзивного майбутнього.
Today, we will work in the format of a roundtable discussion on the theme Global Cooperation and Development Transformations, Challenges, Prospects, Innovations in the following areas of discussion: economic development in a vulnerable world, higher education in the context of sustainable development goals, challenges and expectations, social economy and social development priorities, academic freedom and inclusion in the digital age. All areas of discussion are all linked together by the unifying thesis, community for the intellectual century. That is, the focus of discussions is aimed at brainstorming on key global and regional problems, geopolitical turmoils, stimulating growth to improve living standards, and ensure a fair and inclusive future.
Я впевнений, що нас чекають плідні наукові дискусії, які можуть створити основу спільних наукових проєктів та грантів, подальшої імплементації української наукової думки у світове наукове освітнє співтовариство. Бажаю наснаги всім науковцям, що сьогодні зібрав цей круглий стіл, встановлення нових наукових та освітніх контактів, плідних дискусій на пленарному засіданні та в межах секційних виступів. Дякую.
I am sure that we will have fruitful academic debate, which can create the basis for joint research projects and grants, further implementation of Ukrainian scientific thought in the global scientific and educational community. I wish creative inspiration to all scholars who have joined this roundtable discussion, making new scientific and educational contacts, rich discussions at the plenary session and within breakout sessions. Thank you.
Дякуємо вам, Володимире Степановичу.
Шановні колеги, перед тим, як розпочати нашу конференцію, ми хотіли би зупинитися на деяких організаційних моментах.
Dear colleagues, before starting our conference, we would like to specify some organizational points.
Перше. Робочі мови конференції – англійська та українська. Друге. Задля проведення дискусії питання до спікерів можуть бути поставлені учасниками конференції, які знаходяться в аудиторії, шляхом підключення мікрофону. Учасниками конференції, які працюють в онлайн-режимі, шляхом реакції піднята рука або використання чату. На питання, що надані у чаті, спікери відповідають також у чаті. Третє. Секційні засідання працюватимуть в режимі онлайн.
Working languages of the conference are English and Ukrainian. In order to hold a discussion, conference participants present in the audience can ask questions to the speakers by switching a microphone, and those working online through the raised hand reaction or using chat. If there are questions in the chat, speakers are supposed to answer them in the chat. Breakout sessions are held online.
Шановні колеги, ми переходимо до пленарного засідання нашої конференції, проведення якого заплановано з 10 години до 12:15. Просимо спікерів вкладатися в регламент і розпочинаємо роботу конференції.
Dear colleagues, we proceed to the plenary session of our conference, which will last from 10 a.m. to 12:15 a.m. Dear speakers, we ask you to stick to the time limits of the conference. Thank you.
Я б хотіла передати слово представнику наукової спільноти Сполучених Штатів Америки, доктору філософії в галузі державної політики, старшому економісту корпорації Range, професору політичного аналізу школи державної політики Range Горвард Шатцу. Будь ласка, шановний колега.
I would like to give a floor to Howard Shatz, a representative of the United States scientific community, Doctor of Philosophy in Public Policy, a senior economist at the RAND Corporation, a professor of policy analysis at the RAND School of Public Policy. Please, dear colleague.
Thank you very much. Is my presentation being shown? Yes.
Yes, it's okay.
Very good. And when I speak, should I pause for translation or should I just speak?
No, just speak, please.
All right, excellent. Thank you. And good morning to everyone. It's a great honor to be able to present again to the International Scientific Conference on Economic Development and Legacy of Simon Kuznets. One day soon, I hope to be with you in person. Next slide, please. My topic today is the defense industrial base, and it is fitting that a conference in honor of Simon Kuznets address this topic. Professor Kuznets' work on the defense industrial base issues proved essential to the Allied victory in World War II. Even before the United States entered the war, he noted that if the United States wanted to increase defense industry production without lowering the production of consumer goods, it would need to do two things. It would need sufficient time to move unused resources into the defense sector, and it would need significant levels of government coordination. Next slide, please. The West today is facing a similar, although more modest, challenge. Confronted by the immediacy of Russia's war on Ukraine and the longer-term challenge of China, the West needs to restore and expand its defense industrial base under difficult economic constraints. Our research found that positive reforms had started, especially with expanded production, reforms to procurement, and experiments with innovation. But we also found that constraints could slow reforms, and these constraints were related to political issues, budgetary issues, and demographic issues. This issue is important to the West as a whole, but it's also important to Ukraine, which is now solidly part of the Western partnership. A revitalized Western defense industry can supply Ukraine in war and support Ukraine in peace. And a large, innovative Ukrainian defense industrial base can help the West rearm and restore its own innovation potential. Next slide, please. The work I'm presenting today is based on a report I completed with my talented colleagues Elisa Laufer and Omer Donoff at RAND. We described the West's defense industrial base before the war. We then looked at gaps that the war revealed and investigated what the West was doing about these gaps. We concluded with suggestions for the United States as a whole, what is now the U.S. Department of War, formerly the Department of Defense, and the U.S. Department of the Air Force, which commissioned the research. Next slide, please. We specifically wanted to know, what did Russia's war on Ukraine reveal about the Western defense industrial base? Because there were other efforts going on even before the war and outside of the war. But we focused on, what did the war reveal about the Western defense industrial base? What changes did the war cause? And what would be future prospects for the defense industrial base? We found that the war had three broad-reaching consequences. Number one, the West needs to plan for protracted conflict, for long conflict. For years, the West had planned for short, decisive wars, and yet wars have a way of not going quite as planned. Russia's war on Ukraine proved to be the latest case of a long war in which defense production was not measuring up. Second, we found that the West needs to address these gaps urgently. Given the time it takes to reform and improve the defense industrial base, the West needed to embark on its reforms immediately. And third, we found that Ukraine could serve as a valuable partner in this. Ukraine had managed to scale up quickly and innovate at a pace not seen in decades, setting an example for the Western alliance and partnership. Next slide, please. Let's start with the West's defense industrial base before Russia's full-scale invasion, looking at the defense industrial base in the United States, in the EU and its member states, and in the United Kingdom. They had several issues in common. The first is that they were all highly concentrated. For instance, in the United States, the top 5 defense firms were awarded 30% of all Pentagon contracts and were the prime contractors on 74% of all major acquisition programs. Defense industrial bases in all 3 areas had labor and skills challenges. The workforce throughout the West is aging, and defense companies have to compete with civilian manufacturing companies for a shrinking pool of people who have the skills and the interest in working in manufacturing. But there were some differences. One big difference was that the US defense industrial base dwarfed the others. The US defense industrial base was and is enormous. For example, in this year, 2025, 4 of the top 5 global defense companies are US companies: Lockheed Martin, RTX, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics. A Chinese company is the only non-US company in the top 5. BAE Systems in the UK is number 6, and among firms in the European Union, Thales of France is number 10. The second issue in common, or the second difference was that the EU defense industrial base was highly fragmented and lacked coordination. Defense is a member state responsibility, not an EU responsibility. The EU has been working since the early 2000s to create a more unified defense market via directives, the creation of the European Defense Agency, the creation of something called permanent structured cooperation, but with limited success. And the third difference was that the UK defense industrial base was more isolated. It had difficulty participating in EU-led initiatives, and it had a very high exposure to trade in a very concentrated fashion. Next slide, please. Here you can get a sense of the relative sizes. So US procurement spending was more than 4 times higher than procurement spending in the European Union and the United Kingdom combined. And its research and development, for the US, research, development, test, and evaluation was even larger on a relative basis. Now, this is a point in time, and it doesn't show that all of these had shrunk dramatically since 1991. And notably, like the Western defense industrial base, that of Ukraine had also shrunk and consolidated since 1991. There was one other issue that all of them had in common, including Ukraine, and that was that all 4, the US, the UK, the EU, and Ukraine, had recognized the need for reforms before February 2022. In Ukraine, this included changes to corporate governance and the creation of a variety of international partnerships. Next slide, please. So what did we learn from Russia's war? What did it show us that we didn't know, or that we knew but needed to be reminded of in terms of the defense industrial base? Next slide. For the United States, Russia's war renewed concerns about supply chains and about the slow-moving US acquisition process. Supply chain concerns included concentration of the industry, counterfeit materials and counterfeit inputs, data vulnerabilities, and import reliance. For the European Union and the United Kingdom, Russia's war was a wake-up call that their defense procurement spending was just too low. Both also found fault with their procurement processes. In the EU, short contract periods and fluctuations in demand did not provide enough support for strong investment in the defense sector. The UK's regulatory environment also discouraged growth and investment. Next slide, please. The biggest immediate concern was that Russia's war on Ukraine revealed that the West's defense industrial base was just not ready to rapidly expand production in wartime. This can be seen especially with 155mm munitions, with the Javelin anti-tank system, the Stinger shoulder-fired missile. In fact, the Stinger had not been produced for 2 decades. The United States had to restart Stinger production lines. And also with the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS. And in the case of the United States, this is of special concern because not only is the United States concerned with Europe and with Ukraine and with Russia, but for the United States, China is the pacing challenge, and China has been undergoing a very rapid military buildup. Next slide, please. Now, the West has in fact responded to these challenges, although progress has been slow. Next slide. Defense spending has risen dramatically, not just in level terms, but in relative terms, relative to GDP. The individual countries shown are the historic non-US largest spenders in level terms in NATO. These are the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Italy. We also show Poland, which became number 5 in terms of overall level of defense spending in 2025. Poland, which does have some experience dealing with Russian military aggression, has boosted spending to record peacetime levels. Note especially the heavy red line, which shows NATO defense spending without the United States. You can see there have been increases in 2023, 2024, and 2025, every year after Russia's full-scale invasion. And this shows that NATO countries are in fact serious about improving their defense sectors. This figure finally hit 2.3% in 2025, the first time it was above 2% for NATO members in a long time, certainly since 2014, and possibly for much, much longer. And the data on the chart and the next exclude Germany in 2025, so the figure could be even higher. Germany has increased defense expenditures, and so we might also find that it's for all of NATO, ex-US, it might be more than 2.3%. In 2025, 25 NATO members had the highest defense spending relative to GDP since 2014 that they had had, and probably since much longer. Germany itself was above 2% in 2024, and likely above 2% in 2025. Next slide, please. It's one thing to increase overall defense spending. That money could go towards personnel benefits, healthcare, infrastructure, categories that do not immediately improve readiness or warfighting capabilities. So another measure is spending on defense equipment as a share of total spending. And that's related directly to the defense industrial base. These are purchases from the defense industrial base. Here again, the trajectory is largely up. Of the 29 members with data in 2025, so Germany and Denmark are both missing data for 2025, 18 had their highest level of equipment spending relative to total defense spending in 2025 since at least 2014 and probably longer. It's also likely higher in 2025. Again, look at the solid dark red line. It's also likely higher for all of NATO, although that shows a slight decline because, again, don't forget we're missing Germany from 2025. But Germany's share of spending on equipment relative to total defense spending has risen from a low of 11.8% in 2017 to 21.2% in 2024, so almost doubling as a share of defense spending. That's below the median for NATO members, so that means that Germany probably has much more room for increases in equipment expenditure. Go ahead to the next slide. Let's take a look at how Russia's war has caused changes in individual defense industrial bases. Let's start with the United States. It's important to note that regardless of Russia's war, the United States is focused on China as the pacing challenge. Many defense industrial base measures are related to China. Even so, Russia's war has influenced US policy. The United States came out with its first National Defense Industrial Strategy in January 2024, followed by an implementation plan. Priorities included resilient supply chains, workforce readiness, flexible acquisition, and economic deterrence. Direct outcomes from Russia's war included priorities on national stockpiles and replenishment, working with allies and partners on production, flexible acquisition, and exportability of defense products. Demand for munitions and other armaments led to the expansion or revitalization of some production lines and a renewed focus on stockpiles. Much of the money for armaments for Ukraine helped expand the US defense industrial base, especially in the production of 155mm munitions, Stingers, the Joint Direct Attack Munition extended range, and ground-launched small diameter bombs. Yet implementation will still require sustained cooperation from outside of the Department of War, specifically from Congress and from federal funding, and from commercial firms themselves. Much of the funding in the US remains on an annual basis with occasional disruptions, and private companies have to determine how to recruit, train, and retain new workers. Next slide. Russia's war has also highlighted the importance of unmanned systems. Such systems have been part of US planning for a China contingency, for example, something called the Replicator Initiative, but that urgency has increased. The use of drones in wartime in Ukraine, and especially Ukraine's rapid innovation cycle, have led to these changes in US policy, both on the civilian side and the military side. On the civilian side, President Trump in June released an executive order called Unleashing American Drone Dominance. The Secretary of Defense, or the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, followed this in July with a memorandum on unleashing US military drone dominance with 3 priorities. And I would point out especially one of the priorities was to arm combat units with low-cost drones, boosted by a new procurement strategy that fuses manufacturers with US frontline troops. And that should sound familiar to anybody in Ukraine. Next slide, please. Let's turn to Europe. And I'm going to group both the European Union and the United Kingdom together. Like the United States, they came out with their own strategy papers, as did NATO. The EU produced its first defense industrial strategy. The UK produced 2 new strategies, including a drone strategy that called for spending of £4.5 billion, and that was released in February 2024. NATO as a whole released a defense production action plan. So Russia's war really focused the minds of all of the allies on improving their defense sectors and improving production. We also saw that EU members, at least those in NATO, have increased their defense spending. And the EU instituted several initiatives to incentivize joint production. Recall that I said that the EU defense sector is very fragmented. They introduced a 300 million euro defense industry reinforcement through Common Procurement Act and a 500 million euro act to support ammunition production. As in the United States, the EU has also sought to improve supply chain security. One of their focuses is on European procurement as opposed to imports. But like the United States, they also have challenges. Like the United States, one of their big challenges is the workforce. But one challenge unique to Europe is that the defense sector remains fragmented and there are competing national interests. Next slide. I mentioned new policies amounting to 300 million and 500 million euros. Those are relatively small amounts. So more recently, Europe has gone much, much farther. New reforms including a new commissioner for defense and space, a new white paper on the future of European defense. And one of the charges to the new commissioner for defense and space when President von der Leyen appointed him was that he tried to create a true single market in defense production and strengthen the EU's partnership with NATO. At times, the EU and NATO have not communicated well across their priorities. The major outcome has been the Rearm Europe Readiness 2030 plan. And this calls for unleashing 800 billion euros, not million, 800 billion euros in new defense spending, in part by changing Europe's stiff rules about fiscal spending and budget deficits. That's supposed to increase defense spending in Europe by about 650 billion, and the creation of a new EU fund of 150 billion to incentivize joint production. This is still subject to approval by the European Parliament. And just about a week ago, on October 8th, the Council of the European Union agreed on the negotiating terms for its talk with the Parliament, with the goal of getting this approved by the end of the year. Finally, the NATO alliance itself has committed to substantially increase defense spending, and notably, so it set a target of 5%, and notably, contributions to Ukraine and to Ukraine's defense industry will count as part of that 5%. Next slide. So what can we conclude from this? Next slide. Russia's war changed the political discussion throughout the West. It did so in Europe because of the direct threat. It did so in the United States because it set an example of what modern war looks like, and because the United States stands behind Europe and European security. The specific changes included loosening political constraints and budgetary constraints to a certain degree, not completely. There's still a need for sustained funding, and that's not guaranteed, especially in Europe with its low economic growth and its high social spending. Demographic constraints, especially the aging workforce, remain a problem and will be harder to change. The changes in political and budget constraints led to new initiatives that could improve the volume and speed of defense procurement. New requirements and new technological development have given rise to new non-traditional defense companies, such as Anduril and Palantir in the United States and Helsing in Europe. And at the strategic level, there are two implications for the United States. One is the potential to learn from operations in Ukraine and adapt. And the second is greater incentive to address long-standing defense industrial base issues before conflict starts. Next slide. Our work resulted in one of 5 reports produced as part of a much broader project on the consequences of Russia's war. Collectively, we arrived at a variety of suggestions for the United States, for the Department of War, and for the Department of the Air Force. These can be grouped into policies related to, number one, the overall US defense industrial base. Number 2, partner defense industrial bases. Number 3, space and satellites. Number 4, unmanned systems, such as developing one-way attack drones. Number 5, munitions, especially producing those that would be highest priority in future wars. And last, conflict operations, preparing for operations in degraded environments and exercising decentralized decision-making. Next slide, please. Now, it's one thing to propose policies and reforms, but entirely a different matter to know if you're successful. We identified 5 indicators that would show that the West has successfully reformed its collective defense industrial base. I want to focus on the last 2. Those are less easy to measure, more difficult to achieve, and probably the most important. One is to make sure that the armed forces have what they need to execute plans. That means synchronizing very detailed war plans with defense production. The second is because war is unpredictable, it's important to have a defense industrial base that can shift production quickly to keep supplying what the armed forces need as war changes. Next slide. I want to conclude with some thoughts about Ukraine's defense industrial base. As you know, it has grown substantially, and there have been necessary improvements in governance, right? But where it really stands out, and what Western observers want to learn, is the development of a unique innovator to warfighter pipeline. Ukraine now has some of the most innovative defense companies in the world, as well as one of the best, if not the best, processes for defense innovation. Next slide. This has led the West to look for partnership opportunities for the immediate and longer-term needs of Western defense. This includes direct funding of Ukraine's defense industry, joint ventures, and production partnerships. Most recently, there's been discussion of a US-Ukraine drone deal. We know these discussions are real and are continuing, but details are scant. Stumbling blocks appear to be export controls by both countries and intellectual property rights. Ukraine's defense industry performance has also led the West to consider the sector an essential part of Ukraine's post-war economic restoration. Ukraine has developed a unique system for rapid innovation and fielding of those innovations. Transferring those skills to a peacetime economy should be a high priority once the war is settled. Next slide, please. My cover slide showed the production of the F-35 fighter jet, one of the most advanced and expensive weapon systems in history. I end with a picture of a drone, and some drones include very simple technology and very cheap technology. Both the very expensive weapon system and the cheap weapon system represent the future of warfare. I want to close as I opened with Simon Kuznets. I said that Professor Kuznets' work on the defense industrial base proved essential to the Allied victory in World War II. During the war, he was one of 3 experts on the US War Production Board with Robert Nathan and Stacey May. And they created the industrialization plan, and therefore the victory plan for the retaking of Europe. It was Simon Kuznets' work that showed that based on US resources and industry, the invasion of Europe could not take place until 1944, when the military wanted to do it in 1943. So it was economics and statistics that guided defense industrial production and that helped win the war. And as we see with Ukraine, perhaps with Ukraine, it can help win the peace as well after the war is ended. I look forward to your comments, questions, and discussion. Thanks for welcoming me to speak to the conference.
Працює, так?
Дякуємо шановному спікеру, пану професору Гарварду Шатцу. Шановні колеги, чи є запитання до доповідача?
We thank to our distinguished speaker for a comprehensive presentation. Thank you. Dear colleagues, do you have any questions to Professor Shatz, please?
Can I ask
Там же ж камера на
questions?
вас.
Thank you very much, dear professor, for your very interesting report, for your participation, and for your support of Ukraine. It's very important for us. And I would like to ask you the questions about slide 13. My question is, you mentioned generational changes in the USDIB, but also highlighted barriers. Could you elaborate on which reforms or policy mechanism are proven most difficult to implement it?
Yes. So thank you. There are two, I think there are two reforms that are going to be most difficult. One is acquisition reform, how we buy our weapons. It takes the United States a long time to develop new weapon systems. This is because we have a very detailed operational test and evaluation system, and because the weapons we buy are very technologically advanced. In fact, in our discussions with the Ukrainian armed forces, our weapons are sometimes too expensive and too technologically advanced because they will get destroyed in the war. So we need to reform our acquisition processes. And of course, the big defense contractors who benefit from the system are against those changes. So there's a lot of political lobbying. The second major issue will be how the defense industrial base is funded. So it's funded on an annual basis. What producers really need is longer multi-year contracts for certainty that they know they can keep producing and they don't have to stop, they don't have to lay off workers. Both of those issues are very well known and reforms are in process, but it's not guaranteed that we'll be successful at that.
Thank you very much. Let me introduce me, Galina Nazarova, Head of Social Economics Department. Thank you very much for your answer.
Дякуємо. Колеги, чи є ще запитання до доповідача?
Чи можна мені запитати?
Так, будь ласка.
Dear colleagues, good day, dear participants and guests of the conference. I am Professor Natalia Gavkalova, the head of Public Administration and Economic Policy Department, Simon Kuznets, Kharkiv National University of Economics. Dear Professor, thank you very much for your topical, interesting, and very informative report. What, in your opinion, may be the reason for such a big increase of Poland's indicators on relative defense spending among NATO members and equipment spending as a share of defense spending? These indicators were presented on your slides. Thank you very much.
Yes, good question. Poland has been remarkable, and in fact, I was in Poland to look at U.S.-Polish defense cooperation in March. I think the most reasonable explanation is that Poland has direct experience with Russian aggression. Poland dealt with this shortly after the Russian Revolution. In fact, we can credit Poland with having saved Europe from the Soviet army, from what was then the Soviet army around 1920. And of course, Poland then had the experience of World War II and many years within the Warsaw Pact. And so of all the countries that are in Europe, Poland saw Russia as a threat earlier than almost everyone else. In fact, for a different research project, a colleague and I were in Europe in 2017. We went to London, Brussels, Berlin, and Warsaw to talk to people about threats they saw on the horizon. And when we met with Polish researchers and think tankers, and we said, what is your primary threat? This is 2017. They all said, Poland, Russia. Our primary threat is Russia. You have to understand that Russia is a threat. And so they see a very big threat, and they've been very serious about acquisition. They have restarted the Polish Second Corps, which was very famous in World War II, and generally improved their defense sector a great deal.
Thank you very much for the answer. Thank you.
Колеги, чи є ще запитання, будь ласка, до доповідача?
Can I ask a question? So concerning the STEM technologies and the development of innovation industry in the US, you mentioned that now your country is going to boost the production and research in the military technologies. But this demands a high rise of STEM specialists. And as we know now, students are not so much interested in these fields of education. And how the government is going to boost participation of young researchers in the military industry. Are there any special financial programs, sponsorship, or you think that your country has enough young specialists and of course mature specialists for the defense industry?
That's a great question, and that's probably the biggest challenge, the hardest challenge. There are a couple things that are happening. First of all, the US has relied on foreign graduate students and foreign workers for many years in its STEM sector. In large part, this has been Chinese students. They're very talented. They will get doctorates or postdocs, work in the industry. This is a problem for us now because many of them are excellent workers and help the United States, but some really are linked to the Chinese security services. So boosting the proportion of non-Chinese, of domestic STEM students has been a challenge, and I don't think we have the answer yet. What has proved to increase the STEM workforce in the innovative firms so far is that many of these firms don't produce just for the defense sector, they produce for the general economy as well. And I'm thinking the most innovative firms like Anduril or Palantir, a large number of government contracts, they're private companies publicly traded. And so the incentive they offer to workers is very high salaries, stock options, the ability to do very well. And so they've managed to attract the workforce they need. It's companies that are maybe not quite as high profile, smaller companies that are going to have problems. We're at the very beginning of this. So don't forget, the defense industry plan came out only a year ago, 2024. And now with the new administration, they're trying to develop programs to help expand the workforce. That is not a good answer. I don't have a good answer. All I can tell you is that it is a high priority, and we are looking at expanding technical education below the full university level, and as well trying to make STEM subjects more attractive to US-based students. No answer yet, but it's probably the biggest challenge we face.
Thank you.
Дякуємо, колеги. Чи є ще запитання до доповідача?
Okay.
Будь ласка.
Dear participants, dear Mr. Shatz, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm head of Enterprise Economics and Business Organization Department, and my question is, tell me please, how do you assess the long-term economic rationale for expanding military capacities during peacetime, considering the competition for resources with such spheres as healthcare, education, and other social program? And also, how do you consider the risk of military fiscal overheating in NATO countries? Thank you.
Another good question. So I do think that the ability to expand the defense sector is positive, certainly in the United States, and in Europe. And this goes back to the labor question. There is one other issue, which is that all of the West is trying to expand its manufacturing sector and manufacturing workforce. And historically, these have proved to be good jobs, right? So we're not talking now at the PhD level or the master's level, but at the technician level, people with a good education, but not a very advanced education, can take these jobs and do well. And they're more interesting jobs than a lot of service jobs. So there's so much effort by the West on expanding manufacturing that I think we're going to see more policies. These could be more tariffs against China. These could be some more subsidies. These could be alliances to improve critical supply chains, right? In terms of fiscal overheating, that has a less definite solution. That's a real problem, and their sacrifices are going to be made. This goes back to what Simon Kuznets said during World War II, which is that resources have to be shifted and things might have to be cut. And Europe and the United States face two different issues. Europe faces the issue of very high social spending and in some ways, a lack of investment. And it's been on the agenda for decades that Europe has to rationalize its social spending or deregulate, right? It's a very heavily regulated economy. And I think deregulation can take it very far. This is something that Mario Draghi, in his report on productivity in Europe, came out with. Now, the US has fewer constraints on funding both defense and non-defense because our borrowing potential is much higher because we have the reserve currency, right? That might end one day, but not quite yet. And so we're less constrained. Our real constraint is going to be the workforce, and our social spending is not as high as in Europe. Lastly, we also can probably do some regulatory reform. We did some major regulatory reform during the first Trump administration, and that regulatory reform actually showed up in the growth data. You could trace some of the specific reforms to specific increases in growth. So it's going to be a combination of cutting some expenditure as well as reforming regulations and trying to boost productivity. As with everything else, not an easy task, but the agenda is pretty clear on what to do.
Thank you very much for your answer.
You're welcome.
Дякую професору Тетяні Власенко. Дякую за цікаву доповідь ще раз нашому спікеру. Шановний професор Гарвард Шатц, до вас надійшли ще запитання у чат.
Dear Professor Shatz, thank you very much once again for your presentation, for your speech, for your answers. You have received questions in the chat. So, dear colleagues, thank you all for your questions.
Шановні учасники конференції, слово для доповіді надається наступному нашому спікеру, доктору філософії, професору економіки Тулузької школи економіки пану Полу Сібрайту. Будь ласка, шановний колего.
Dear participants of the conference, the floor is given to Paul Seabright, a Doctor of Philosophy, Professor of Economics at Toulouse School of Economics, France. So, dear Professor, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be speaking to this community. I have been moved and inspired by the courage that you have shown in your terrible challenges of the last 3.5 years. It is, as I say, a great honor to be able to be with you and to express my support for your struggle. It is also fascinating and humbling to speak after Howard Shatz and his session on your immediate challenges. I come from a country, France, which is currently struggling to pass a budget, which would involve making some small cuts to one of the most generous pension systems that has ever been known in the history of the world. And our population does not want to do it. And they don't want to think about the existential challenges we face. That's a very worrying thing for us in France. It is very worrying to see how our citizens are willfully blind to the dangers at our borders. So for all of these reasons, I'm very pleased to be here this morning. I have also been struck by the fact that Howard Schatz's discussion touched on very immediate existential challenges for you. And I'm almost embarrassed that my talk is going to be much less immediate, is going to take a much longer term perspective. I have been interested for a long time, not so much in the question of how you end wars, although this is clearly your priority now, but how we can think about making them less likely to happen in the first place. And it is in that spirit that I want to share with you a project that I'm currently working on with my colleague Guido Friebel from the University of Frankfurt. Could we see the slides, please, or do you want me to share my screen? I don't currently see the slides. Are they...
Запитую, шановний професор, чи потрібна презентація?
Зараз буде презентація, да.
Right, good. So thank you very much. This is a presentation called Dementia Risk in Political and Business Leaders, Alarming Lessons from the Medical Literature. Next slide, please. So what I want to do is to share with you a sketch of a book project, which we're calling Leaders Who Lose It, What Can We Do? We currently have a draft. It's not a final draft, but it's a draft that would be relatively close to being in a state to be published. It'll be very short. It'll only have 140 pages at the most. And it will say we have an urgent question. So this is not one of these books that represents decades of research distilled into a large definitive answer to a question. Rather, this is a book that puts a question on the table, motivated by something that we have seen in the medical literature that we have reviewed, and which we do not believe has come sufficiently urgently to the attention of researchers in politics, strategic studies, and organizational economics. So let me tell you what the question is, and I'm going to do so in two graphs. One, which is on the next slide, please, is about the aging of world leaders. This gives a summary of what in the book will be a rather longer section. In this graph, we look at the average age of political leaders in the last century and a half from 1875 to 2015. And we've divided it into leaders in Europe, leaders in the United States, and leaders in the rest of the world. Leaders in the United States are not just presidents, but also state governors. And what you can see is that in the United States, which is in the blue line, the age of political leaders went up and down for about half a century, but at least until and since the end of the Second World War, it has been fairly steadily rising. And the average age of political leaders is now about 10 years higher than it was at the end of the Second World War. In the rest of the world, again, there's been a number of ups and downs, but essentially for most of the period since the Second World War, the average age of political leaders has been rising steadily and is now closer to 20 years higher than it was at the end of the Second World War. Europe is a little different in the sense that the ages of political leaders seem to rise during periods of stability, but during periods of instability, as in the First World War and as after the collapse of the Soviet bloc at the end of the 1980s, there have been periods in which Europe's leaders have been getting younger. Now, many people have said to us since we started this project, well, you know, what's so worrying about that? Populations are getting older. It's normal that if the populations are getting older, the leaders should be getting older too. Maybe older leaders are wiser on average. All of that may be true. As it happens, and we go into this in the book, the correlation between the aging of populations in various countries and the aging of their political leaders is very weak. The currently oldest political leader in the world is President Paul Biya of Cameroon, who has just announced his intention to stand for another term of office at the age of 93. He is standing for a 7-year term of office, and the median age of the population in his country is 18 years old. So think about that for a moment. That means half of the population of his country had not yet been born when he had been in power for a quarter of a century. So there doesn't seem to be very much correlation between the aging of countries and the aging of their leaders. And as we say very clearly in the book, what worries us about the aging of leaders is not the average age. It may well be that a leader who's 55 is a little wiser on average than a leader who is 50. What we're worried about is the tail risk at the top end of leaders who lose their ability to engage in shrewd strategic judgment because of the infirmities of old age and particularly of dementia. So if you could move to the next slide, please, I'd like to tell you the argument in the second main slide. And this comes from the medical literature. So we call it the metacognition. Metacognition is cognition about cognition. And let me quickly explain what I mean by that and then explain this graph to you. So we know that as we go through life, our cognition, which is the ability to understand the environment in which we live and work, is subject to a whole lot of changes. As we are young and we get older, we get to understand our environment better. As we age through middle age and into old age, we begin to be challenged a little bit in our ability to see our environment. Now I use glasses to read. I didn't have to until quite recently. But more importantly, we start to lose our ability to judge how reliable is our own cognition. That is to say, it's not just that we are becoming less good at navigating our environment, we're also becoming less good at knowing how well we navigate our own environment. So let me explain what this graph says. This graph comes from a socio-medical study which was published last year in 2024, and which followed some 8,000 patients in the United States who had been matched. These were patients who were diagnosed with, as they call it, probable dementia. So PWPD in this graph means persons with probable dementia. As I'm sure many of you will know, there are no definitive diagnoses of dementia because dementia isn't a single condition. It doesn't have a single pathogen responsible for it. So these are people who, at a certain period in their lives, were diagnosed as being very probably afflicted with dementia. There is a standard protocol for diagnosing this. There were over 3,000 of them, and they were matched with another 5,000 individuals on the basis of some observable socioeconomic variables and clinical variables. And they were followed over a period of 16 years. Now, the 16 years go from 10 years before their diagnosis to 6 years after their diagnosis. What I'd like you to see is that 10 years before a diagnosis, the controls and the persons with probable dementia, that's to say the people who would eventually be diagnosed, were very closely matched in terms of their overall financial wealth. But beginning between 8 and 6 years before they were diagnosed, these people began to lose financial wealth at a quite alarming rate. And by the time of their diagnosis, they had lost over 80% of their financial wealth relative to people who had previously been similar to them, but were not eventually diagnosed with dementia. And what this is telling us, we believe, though we discuss some reservations about this in the book, we believe this is telling us that essentially people's judgment in matters of financial management is being undermined over 6 years before the medical symptoms of dementia become to be visible to doctors. And this is very worrying because it suggests that doctors can tell when there is something medically wrong with us, but they can't tell until over 6 years of faulty judgment have begun to take their toll on our important decisions. These are financial decisions, but I leave you to imagine some of the other strategic and indeed existential decisions that may be being made by the people who are eventually diagnosed with dementia. So if we could move to the next slide, please, I will very quickly summarize the other arguments. I won't have time to finish all of my slides, but I will give you a sketch of what they contain. So I want to explain why we should be concerned, we meaning both researchers and world citizens. I want to explain why the medical evidence that we're seeing is so disturbing for our understanding of how people exercise judgment. And then I'll give you a quick sketch of that evidence, and I'll try to do that in 5 minutes. Next slide, please. So the current president of the United States is going to be 82 at the end of his term. And we know that on average, an 80-year-old dementia-free US male's dementia risk is about 2.5% per annum and lifetime 30%. And that means there's at least a 10% risk of dementia during the term. Now, although I don't want to get into the details of the Joe Biden case, one of the things it does reveal is not something about him, but about his entourage. It was very clear that the interview given to the New Yorker in 2024 by Nancy Pelosi, who played an important role in persuading him to step down from the campaign to re-election, what was very clear was that she said she had intervened because she did not believe that he could beat Donald Trump in the election. She at no point claimed that she intervened because it would have been a bad thing for the United States to have a president with dementia. And our concern is that almost no country that we can think of has mechanisms for removing from power a leader who might take existentially dangerous decisions for their country while in office. Next slide, please. So the real problem about this is that dementia undermines judgment. It doesn't just undermine the ordinary ability of people to do their jobs, including such mundane things as the ability to get down the steps of an aircraft without stumbling. Most crucially, it undermines their ability to make good judgments about the important strategic decisions they have to take. So next slide, please. In the book, we discuss the importance of judgment, but if you could move to the next slide again, please. The crucial thing is that judgment differs from what we call skill. Next slide, please. So the important difference between skill and judgment is that skill involves tasks that are codifiable and that are immediately visible. So I can tell whether somebody else has juggling skills without being able to juggle myself. And I can tell immediately. I can see a juggler, I can tell that they do it well. The problem with judgment is that I can't really tell whether somebody else has good judgment unless I exercise good judgment myself. I can't tell whether a president of the United States is exercising good judgment in their relations with China or with Russia without going through many of the same steps that they've been able to do. But unfortunately, the political process in almost all countries known to us selects leaders for their skills, but not for their judgment. And I'd like to cite this quotation from a former UK cabinet minister, Rory Stewart, who wrote a very fascinating memoir. He says, "As I developed my reputation, I felt that I was being overvalued for things I did not value, such as my ability to remember facts and speak at the dispatch box without notes, and undervalued for things I rated, such as my judgments on Afghanistan, my work in Cumbria, etc. Next slide, please. So the basic problem is that aging leaders lose their judgment, potentially leading to catastrophe, and they become entrenched. And there are three reasons we discuss in the book for this entrenchment. There's what we call the information problem, that it's difficult to collect information about the condition of a leader. There's the commitment problem, that it's very hard for the people involved who have the information to commit to measures that would take a leader with dementia away from making dangerous judgments. And then there's the question of how to enforce the removal of a leader if the leader doesn't want to go. Now, could you please move forward several slides until I tell you to stop, because I'm running out of time. Please move forward. Next slide. And next slide. And next slide. Right. We're gathering in the book two kinds of evidence. There's detailed demographic information about leaders in politics, and then there's this medical, psychological evidence about the effects on decision-making of aging in general and dementia in particular. So next slide, please. So I want to report two studies. The second is the one I showed you one graph from, but the first is a study of 16,000 adults over 50 years old by Mazzone and Peracchi, also published in 2024. And I should say, by the way, that we're only just starting to see these studies because they all involve studying people in panels for 10 to 15 years. Now, what they notice is that older people tend to underestimate their cognitive decline. They have, in the words that I used before, very poor metacognition. But importantly, it's the ones who don't realize that their cognitive decline is happening who show the biggest losses in financial wealth. So what these researchers have done is divided subjects into three groups: those who did not show major cognitive decline, those who did show major cognitive decline but were worried about it, and those who did show major cognitive decline but were not worried about it. And what this study shows is that the most serious losses in financial resources were amongst the people who showed major cognitive decline but were not worried about it, did not realize it was happening. The second study is the one that I've shown you something of, and I'd like to show you another couple of graphs now. So could you move to the next slide, please? This is the one I showed you before. No, sorry, this is related to individuals' overall net worth, which begins its decline about 8 years before the diagnosis. The next slide shows the one I showed you before, which is their financial wealth declines by even more. Now, it may be that they're making decisions about, for example, reducing their cash balances in order to move into old age homes. And we don't know that, but there's other evidence we discuss in the book that suggests that's not the whole story. And then if you look at the next slide, you will see further evidence that the rate of home ownership among these people is declining dramatically. I think I should stop now because I'm running out of time and I would be happy to take your questions. But let me quickly summarize what I think is the challenge before us. The challenge is that the medical evidence about the conditions of old age, and particularly dementia, do not just suggest that the diseases of old age are diminishing the ability of leaders to do their job. We knew that already. What instead the diseases of old age are doing is undermining the ability of leaders even to realize that they cannot do their job anymore. And that is likely to happen to a much greater extent in the years to come than it has done even up to now. We know, of course, that there are many leaders that could not do their job. We know, of course, that there were many leaders that took risky, even existential decisions affecting their countries and others. You in a Ukraine hardly need me to remind you of that now. But what is most worrying is that the medical evidence suggests that we will have more and more leaders who are not only unable to do a responsible and prudent job for their countries, but have no idea just how seriously their ability to do so is being undermined. I will stop there and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Дякую, щиро дякую, пане Сібрайту. Шановні колеги, у кого є запитання до спікера?
Dear Professor, we are very thankful to your fruitful presentation and report. Thank you very much. So, dear colleagues, do you have any questions to the speaker?
Будь ласка, шановні колеги.
Так, у нас питання є.
Да.
Good day, everybody. So my name is Olena Kota. I'm a head of the Department of International Economics and Management. And first of all, I'm truly grateful for your interesting and insightful presentation and report. And my question, so what managerial and institutional mechanisms do you consider most effective in mitigating the negative consequence of dementia among individuals responsible to making strategically important decisions? Thank you.
That's a great question, and we spend quite a big part of our book discussing that. Now, the news on this is both good and bad. The good news is that we are starting to have much more detailed biomarker information about the progress of the factors causing dementia in the elderly. In particular, medical researchers have now identified a number of protein markers in the blood which are associated with later development of dementia diagnosis and which can be identified in the blood some years before the actual dementia diagnosis is made according to other factors. So I think there is good news that we are likely to be able to find some advanced markers of probable future dementia. That's the good news. The bad news is twofold. The first piece of bad news is that even though we may know that these biomarkers are associated with an increased risk of future dementia diagnosis, we have at the moment absolutely no idea how they are associated with declining judgment today. And that's, of course, the thing that we really need to know about. We need to know whether a leader who has higher levels of tau, p-tau 247 in their blood is actually not able to assess strategic risks. And that at the moment we have absolutely no idea about. And the current research being done is all linking levels of p-tau 247 and other blood markers to future dementia diagnosis probability, not to current deficiencies in judgment. And clearly the medical literature needs to do that. But the problem is that medics, for very good reasons, are concerned about being humane to their patients, which is absolutely reasonable. They're not principally focused on the risks to the rest of society. The second piece of bad news is that we have, I think, as a society, great refusal to look certain risks in the face. I want to contrast two things that we do for airline pilots and car drivers. Airline pilots currently are required to retire at the age of 65 by the rules of the ICAO. And I think in all countries, this is more or less true, except in Japan, where it's 67 years old. But there is a lot of agitation among pilots to increase that age because they say, well, look, many of us at the age of 65 were perfectly capable of flying a plane. And it looks as though there may be some willingness to increase that. And the discussion around this is all in terms of being fair and reasonable to the pilots and not in terms of thinking about the risks to the rest of society. Contrast this with driving cars, where no country, to my knowledge, imposes an upper age limit on car drivers. This is in spite of the fact that air crashes cause several hundred deaths a year in the world, but car crashes cause about 1 million deaths per year in the world. And in the world, we are steadfastly refusing to look in the face the risks of older drivers who are unable to drive properly and unable to exercise judgment in driving, even though over 1 million deaths a year are being caused by car accidents. Not all of them by old drivers, I should hasten to say. So in my view, the big problem with finding mechanisms is not just finding medical mechanisms, it's reaching a social consensus about the importance of leaders retiring. And in my view, we will never reach a consensus that says a certain level of p-tau in the bloodstream means the leader should retire. The only consensus we will ever conceivably reach is one that says leaders over a certain age, 70 years, 75 years, I don't know, should retire from making existential decisions. And I think we're a very long way away from reaching such a consensus.
Okay, thank you. I absolutely agree with you. Thank you very much.
Дякуємо, пані Олена. Шановний пане Сібрайте, до вас надійшли питання у чат, і ми переходимо до наступного доповідача. Тетяна Валеріївна.
Так. Шановні колеги, продовжуємо роботу нашої конференції, і до виступу запрошується ректор нашого університету, доктор економічних наук, заслужений діяч науки і техніки України, кавалер орденів за заслуги 3-2 ступенів, ордена князя Ярослава Мудрого 5 ступеня, академік Національної академії педагогічних наук України Володимир Пономаренко.
Dear Professor Seabright, please see the questions to you in the chat and answer, please, if you please. And now we are
Thank you very much for your welcome and your discussion. I will answer the questions in the chat.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And now we are giving the floor to Volodymyr Ponomarenko, rector of our university, doctor of economic sciences, professor, honored worker of science and technology of Ukraine, cavalier of the Order of Merit of the 3rd and the 2nd degrees, Order of Prince Yaroslav the Wise of the 5th degree, full member of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Володимире Степановичу, please.
Дякую. Шановні колеги, наступний слайд давайте зразу. Зрозуміло, що в умовах війни, чи війна не може не відобразитися, відбиток мати на всі сторони життя нашого і, ясна річ, на фінансування освіти в Україні і, ясна річ, що в тому числі на ЗВО. Ми маємо трансформацію фінансової моделі в умовах невизначеності в усіх варіантах, міграції студентів та науково-педагогічних працівників, руйнування інфраструктури. Наступний слайд. Взагалі, наші ЗВО в Україні мають декілька джерел фінансування. Перше з них – це бюджетні кошти, це державне замовлення, загальний фонд так званий, кошти фізичних та юридичних осіб, це контракти і спеціальний фонд, і альтернативні джерела, гранти, кредити, ваучери. Наступний слайд. Якщо ми розглянемо, яка доля ВВП витрачається на освіту, то ми бачимо неухильне зниження цього відсотку, починаючи з 22-го року, коли починались військові дії. У 25-му році за перший квартал 2,1%, а я вам скажу, що обіцяють, що в цьому році секвестру не буде, і ми вийдемо десь приблизно на 5%. Будемо дивитися. Наступний слайд. То дані по всій системі освіти, а зараз слайд по бюджетному фінансуванню якраз заклади вищої освіти, університети, академії, інститути. Дані графіки по 22-му і 23-му році в мільярдах гривень ми бачимо скорочення. Скорочення достатньо суттєве по 23-му року, по 24-му року немає даних. По Міністерству захисту здоров'я МОЗ у нас також скорочення з 2 мільярдів до 1 мільярда 7 мільярда гривень. Зростання є деяке по Міністерству внутрішніх справ. Ну, це зрозуміло. Наступний слайд, будь ласка. Які у нас фінансові ризики? На рівні макрорівень у нас інфляційні ризики, ясна річ. Секвестри бюджету, які можуть бути, також ясно. Бюджетний ризик перерозподілу, як я казав, може бути на оборону, так, і дійсно це використовується. І ризики зменшення міжнародної допомоги на освіту. На мікрорівні у нас також існують суттєві ризики. Це ліквідність, нездатність покривати поточні зобов'язання нашими ЗВО, експлуатаційні ризики – це зростання вартості комунальних послуг, ремонту, ризик залежності від разових грантів чи допомоги іноземних стейкхолдерів і зростання непрофільних витрат, так як ми зараз утримуємо в наших гуртожитках тимчасово переміщених осіб. Наступний слайд, фізичне руйнування. Далі я покажу, наскільки це суттєво впливає, а зараз перерахую тільки фізичне рахування, міграція внутрішня і зовнішня, падіння надходжень від контрактної форми навчання, тому що зниження платоспроможності населення, демографічна криза. І все ж таки у цих умовах ми якось працюємо. Наступний слайд. За роки повномасштабної війни з України виїхали разом з батьками більше 340 тисяч підлітків. Багато з них, молодих цих людей, вже почали навчатися за кордоном або знаходяться на межі вступу до іноземних ЗВО. Кількість українських студентів у західних університетах, дані минулого року, 115 тисяч осіб. Зараз набагато зросла ця цифра. Наступний слайд. За даними Світового банку, тільки у 2022 році з України виїхало 6 мільйонів гривень. По іншим даним, це перевищує вже 9 мільйонів гривень. Осіб, вибачаюсь. З них, якщо ми розглянемо структуру здобувачів, більше 600 тисяч. І освітян, мається на увазі керівників і вчителів, і НПП. Якщо ми розглянемо дані Міністерства освіти і науки України, то у нас виїхало за кордон 3840 здобувачів, не здобувачів, а НПП. Наступний слайд. Більш детально по викладачам. У нас існує міграція не тільки за кордон, а між нашими регіонами. Багато людей переїжджає з прифронтових регіонів у більш безпечні регіони. От в 22-23 року, наприклад, перемістилися з безпечних регіонів, з небезпечних перемістились в безпечні. Як ви бачите, 5 тисяч у 22-му році і в 23-му році 4 тисячі. Інакше кажучи, більше 9 тисяч з ЗВО прифронтових територій переїхали в інші регіони країни. Що стосується переміщення наших викладачів за кордон. У 2022 році зареєстровані випадки 3840 осіб, а у 2023 році 2768 осіб. Зараз ця цифра трошки більша. Наступний слайд. Суттєвим джерелом надходжень до бюджету наших ЗВО, наших університетів є плата за навчання іноземних студентів. Подивіться на діаграму. З 2014 року, коли у нас було майже 70 тисяч іноземних студентів, у 2024-2025 році залишилось біля 25 тисяч. Це різке скорочення фінансування за рахунок іноземних здобувачів. Наступний слайд. Стосовно руйнування. Я на початку доповідь казав, що більш детальні цифри дам. І от по всім закладам освіти, за даними на 24 рік, зруйновано 394 закладів освіти. Пошкоджено біля 4 тисяч закладів освіти. Наступний слайд. З цих закладів освіти розглянемо ті, які стосуються університетів, академій і інститутів. Повністю зруйновано 4 університети і академії. 117 з них зазнали пошкоджень. І це тільки на 24.11.24 року. Уже у цьому році навіть в Харкові іще у нас пошкоджено декілька закладів освіти. Наступний слайд. Територіальне розміщення ЗВО, зрозуміло, накладає і складності по фінансуванню. Це обумовлено і тим, що у нас, як я вам казав, уже і здобувачі від'їжджають, контингент падає, і іміджові втрати. Якось вони стимулюють нас і вимагають від держави і від нас всіх якось підтримати ті ЗВО, які знаходяться в прифронтових територіях. Наступний слайд. Дуже показово є графік, діаграма вступу до наших університетів в порівнянні з 2021 роком. Зверніть увагу, що по вступу нижче втратили вступників, яка Дніпропетровський регіон, Миколаївський регіон, Одеса, а більше за все втратили, як бачимо, Харківський регіон, тому що тут багато закладів вищої освіти і вони втрачають більше. Наступний слайд. Якщо я там показував по вступникам втрати, то тепер я вам показую втрати по контингенту. І ми бачимо, що фактично із всіх регіонів університети Харківського регіону втратили найбільше. Тобто практично 20% ми не дорахувались контингенту наших здобувачів в наших університетах Харківської області. Наступний слайд. Держава і наше міністерство розуміє, що треба підтримувати, необхідно підтримувати ці заклади освіти, які функціонують на прикордонні у нашому. Наступний слайд. І вони ввели регіональний коефіцієнт підтримки в розмірі 1,1% по фінансуванню загального фонду по одній із частин. І коефіцієнт 1,07 для вступників, для того, щоб вони мали більшу можливість поступити на бюджет. Але наші розрахунки показали, що така підтримка, вона практично нічого не дає. Ми зробили моделювання фінансування закладів освіти в Україні. Якщо б цей коефіцієнт був для всіх однаковий, інакше кажучи, убрали вплив цього коефіцієнту. І з'ясувалося, що втрати фінансування тих регіонів, які дійсно знаходяться на прикордонні, вони дуже незначні, інакше кажучи, вплив регіонального коефіцієнта майже не відчувається у кожному університеті. Наступний слайд покажіть, будь ласка. Зверніть увагу, якщо б не було цього коефіцієнту, наприклад, університети Харківського регіону недоотримали б 0,9%. 0,9% – це дуже невеликі кошти. Інакше кажучи, вплив цього коефіцієнту практично не допомагає тим університетам, які працюють в складних умовах. Наступний слайд. Те, що я вже сказав, що цей вплив фактично не перевищує 1%. Тому наш університет розробив рекомендації і пропозиції. Наступний слайд. Пропозиції для Міністерства освіти і науки України для того, щоб більше підтримати заклади освіти, які функціонують на територіях можливих бойових дій. Формула фінансування передбачає дві складових. Перша складова – це фонд фінансування за показниками діяльності, де дійсно запровадження цей регіональний коефіцієнт, те, що я вже казав. А ми пропонуємо застосувати його не тільки для цієї складової, а і для фонду стабільності діяльності, який в цілому складає десь на рівні 80% від цього фінансування. І тоді хоча б на рівні 1,1%. В результаті цього ми промоделювали наступний слайд. І отримали наступні дані. Якщо, як я вже казав, при діючій системі ми отримуємо десь 1% по діючій формулі додатково, то по тій формулі, які ми пропонуємо, додаткове фінансування буде дорівнювати десь 7,6%. Це вже суттєво. Перші розмови і перші пропозиції на рівні Міністерства освіти начебто позитивно сприйняті. І я сподіваюся, що наші пропозиції будуть прийняті. Дякую за увагу. Наступний слайд. Дякую за увагу.
Дякуємо шановному доповідачеві, професору, доктору економічних наук Володимиру Пономаренко. Шановні колеги, які є запитання до доповідача? Будь ласка, прошу. Будь ласка.
Вельмишановний Володимире Степановичу, у мене є питання таке, які...
Представтесь, будь ласка.
З маленьких питань складаються. Я є Ястремська Олена Миколаївна, завідувач кафедри менеджменту, логістики та інновацій, доктор наук, професор. І щодо питань. Скажіть, будь ласка, чи є такі дані зараз про фактичні ціни в Україні підготовки здобувачів, які склалися після того, як прийом вже пройшов? І наскільки ці ціни відрізняються в Харківському регіоні та в інших регіонах України? Це було б дуже цікаво від вас почути вашу думку з цього приводу. Будь ласка.
Да, дякую. Ми провели дослідження. Це було непросто, тому що треба було проаналізувати всі ціни по всім освітнім програмам, по всім університетам країни. Ми це зробили. Виділили найбільш характерну освітню програму це менеджмент, до речі. От, і з'ясувалося, що середні ціни по регіонам, які встановлені для контрактників по цій освітній програмі, в Харкові набагато вищі, ніж по багатьом, по іншим, навіть небезпечним регіонам. Ну, для прикладу можу сказати так, що середня вартість контракту по освітній програмі менеджмент в Харкові дорівнює десь приблизно 50 тисяч гривень, тоді як середня по Україні менше 40 тисяч. Більш того, на нашому рівні десь приблизно Київ, ЗВО, які працюють в Києві, а всі інші значно менше. До чого це привело? Це привело до того, що контрактники, коли вони отримали вже свої результати і вони зрозуміли, що вони не поступають на бюджет, вони подавали свої заяви, вже орієнтуючись на ці ціни. І ціни були, ви бачите, які. Інакше кажучи, це, так би мовити, спровокувало зменшення контрактників у нашому регіоні, по університетах нашого регіону. Ми вийшли з пропозицією до міністерства про те, що треба ввести регіональний коефіцієнт при встановленні індикативної вартості навчання. Індикативна вартість навчання – це мінімальна границя, нижче якої не можна встановлювати ціни. Це в рамках боротьби з демпінгуванням. От, розглядається зараз це питання. Ми просимо так зробити, щоб ціни в наших регіонах, в регіонах, де можливі бойові дії, були по індикативній вартості менше або хоча б на рівні середніх по Україні. Розглядається це питання, але в минулому році ми виходили з цією пропозицією, вона не була прийнята. Але зараз прийшли зміни деякі в керівництві нашого міністерства. Я сподіваюся, що до нас дослухаються. Дякую.
Дякуємо вам, Володимире Степановичу. Володимир Степановичу, до вас ще є запитання у чаті, а ми, шановні колеги, продовжуємо роботу нашої конференції. Дякуємо.
Шановні колеги, продовжується робота нашої конференції. До виступу запрошується пан Річард Гріфіс, виконавчий директор Інституту культури, співпраці та менеджменту Технологічного інституту Флориди, США. Будь ласка, шановний колега.
We thank our distinguished director for a comprehensive report and informative presentation. And now we move on to the next speaker, Richard Griffith, Executive Director of the Institute of Culture, Collaboration and Management of the Florida Institute of Technology, the United States of America. So, dear colleague, please, the floor is yours. Dear colleague, dear Mr.
Sorry about that.
So,
can you hear me now, sir?
Yes. Please,
Okay.
please, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, so when I was little, I very much enjoyed my father telling me stories. And the stories I liked the most were Bible stories because they were so big and very dramatic. And the story that I loved dearly, but it terrified me, was the story of the Tower of Babel. I'm sure you're aware of this story, but the way that it went, the people of Babylonia had survived the Great Flood, and they were going to build a tower so that the flood would not threaten them again. But they got proud and they decided they wanted to build the tower very tall so that it reached into the heavens. And God came down from the heavens and said, "These are one people, they speak one language, and nothing will be impossible for them." And he cursed them. He made them speak all different languages and he cast them around the world. And I think what terrified me the most when I was young was that if something went wrong, humanity wouldn't be able to solve the problem because we didn't really understand each other. My name is Richard Griffith. I am the executive director of the Institute for Cross-Cultural Management in Florida. And my PhD is in industrial organizational psychology. I've done quite a bit of research as a young professor, but I've moved into more of an executive role now, leading this research institute and helping bring in projects for our faculty and our students. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about the way that our brain processes culture and being different from other individuals, and then emphasize what we can do to be able to help our leaders become more strategic in their view of culture and how it impacts organizational processes. And then I'm going to demonstrate a few case studies that we have done at Florida Tech, and then we will put a wrap on the presentation. So some years ago, I was walking on the beach, having a cup of coffee in Florida, and it occurred to me that culture is not real, that it is a social abstraction that we have made up to describe the differences that occur when you are living in one part of the world and then I live in another part of the world. It's not like a physical property. It's not like air and water. It's just a way that we use to simplify these differences that we encounter. And at the very same time, it started to occur to me, well, we encounter a lot of differences all the time, every day. We encounter people who have a different educational background or a different professional background, or you might be one sex and I might be the other. And what that ends up doing is it draws a line in the sand. And you're standing on one side of the line and I'm on the other side of the line. And it causes a lot of cognitive processing problems, ultimately communication problems, and may slow down or stop any major initiatives we have because of these miscommunications. So, what happens when we meet someone who is different than us? Well, in the first 250 milliseconds, one quarter of a second, we determine whether or not they are the same or different. If they are the same as us, then the processing that occurs happens very deeply. We pay attention to details. If the person is different than us, then systems one of our processing takes over. We process it much more shallowly. And in effect, what we begin to do is stereotype. Those cognitive failures that occur lead to what are very serious emotional outcomes. When we meet someone who's different than us, we have higher levels of arousal, higher levels of anxiety. There are lower levels of trust that starts to occur. And that makes it very difficult for people who come from different cultural backgrounds to work together successfully to be able to solve what are big world problems. And we have lots of big world problems that we need to solve. The brain, my background is a psychologist, so you'll have to forgive me for talking about it, but the brain is such an incredible, incredible organ, and it does very, very many things very powerfully. But the number one thing that it does is to be able to categorize things. And the most salient categorization that we can have is same versus different. And if it were just a cognitive issue, that would be less of a problem. but it tends to roll over into all of the behaviors and the plans and the decisions that we make. And if we don't address those issues, then we're not able to collaborate to solve major world problems. What are some of those problems? Well, as you all know, global business is contracting. We're backing away from globalism, and that's happening across the world. I certainly see it in the United States. I'm sure you see it in the news. I'm well aware of some of the problems that are occurring in Ukraine and in other parts of the world in the Middle East. We see that even though global business is contracting, there's still $85 trillion of business that is done every year. So it's a huge opportunity that is lost. And we know that about 70% of international ventures fail, largely due to culture. Now, that's just the business side of it, but there's a lot of ways that we interact, and there's a lot of geopolitical tensions around the world, and lots of uh, disease issues that can harm humanity if we don't collaborate. These problems are so large that there won't be a single country that will solve them. There won't be a single company that will solve them. We'll need to work together to be able to solve these issues. And to do that, we're going to need to be able to manage what are these cultural differences that have slowed us down over the course of humanity. I don't know if you are football fans. I am a football fan very much. I would say American football more than European football or world football. But I'll use this as an example to give you an idea of what we'll need to do as leaders. So the machine you're seeing in front of you is called a jugs machine. And when these two tires spin, what it does is it fires that football out very far, very fast. And if you were standing close to that jugs machine, you would be in danger. You would not be able to react quick enough to stop that ball from hitting you, and it would probably break your nose. What would you need to do to be safe? Well, you would need to stand far away. If you were standing 100 meters away, you would see the ball fire from the machine and you could track its trajectory, and you could just step to the left or step to the right. And the same thing is true when you are a leader thinking about working with other people, collaborators from other nations. You need to be able to see far away. You need to have what is a very complete vision of the objectives that you're trying to obtain so that you can plan for any kind of problems that might arise, any kind of crisis that might slow down the progress that you're making on these particular initiatives. So vision becomes incredibly important for world leaders and business leaders and scientific leaders across the board. We need to be able to see far away if we're going to be able to stop some of these problems. Sadly, that's not what we do when it comes to cross-cultural competence. Usually, when people start bringing up cross-cultural competence, it's because a mistake has been made. And companies often will just throw training at the problem to try to solve it. And it's very much just like wrapping up your ankle if you've twisted your ankle. It doesn't solve the problem. It just allows you to hobble around the room for a little bit. And we continue to do this and never really think about the root source of the problem. And that's dysfunctional thought patterns. From our leadership, we need to be thinking in a more long-range fashion so we can come up with what are more permanent solutions. And to do this, we need to be strategic. That's the long-term view of the organization that we're running, rather than the operational view, which might be the systems that are operating or the tactical decisions that are made every day. Most solutions in the culture space are purely tactical. They never get into a strategic space. And I believe this is a change that we need to be able to make with the leaders of our organization if we are to solve some of these large world problems. In effect, what we have to be able to do is understand what our strategic objectives are. And then we can actually think about how would culture get in the way of those particular initiatives that are leading to those objectives. And in effect, what we can then do is engineer solutions and retro engineer those solutions so that we can meet our strategic objectives. I've worked in the culture space for many years now, and I would say that kind of thinking is very rare. Most times people just throw training at a group of individuals, the training comes off the shelf, and we never think about what it is that the group is trying to do. And I think if you don't have clear strategic vision, if you don't understand the objectives that you are setting out to attain, you have very little chance of addressing culture in the appropriate way. We're not able to actually solve the problem. Again, we just are throwing a band-aid on what is a scrape on the knee or scrape on the elbow. Understanding culture or understanding the strategic impacts of culture will allow for a more permanent solution. I'm going to try to illustrate this with a few of the case studies that we have done at Florida Tech, and then I'm going to talk to you about what is a current initiative that I think you'll find very exciting that brings in what is some modern technology to address some of these issues. So the first case that I will talk about is the Orlando International Airport. I don't know how many of you have been to the United States in the past, but if you have, many of you have traveled to Orlando. The airport was built in the 1970s to hold about 20 million people a year, and now about 70 million people a year go through that airport. So they've built what is a new terminal, that is the international terminal at the airport, and we were contracted to help them build what is the world's first culturally competent airport. They wanted to make sure that everybody who went through that airport had a good customer experience, no matter where they come from in the world. And it was quite a challenging project. There are many pieces of it. I'm only going to talk about a couple, given the time that we have this morning. So one of the very first things that the airport needed to understand was what is customer experience, how to measure customer experience, and how may that differ across the world. And to do that, you have to understand culture, and you have to understand the interactions from individuals. So, for instance, in the United States, a customer service representative might ask me how my day was going. If I was standing in line, they might say, "Hello, sir, how was your day?" And there's a superficial interaction that would occur that US Americans would find pleasant. And that's not true in every place in the world. One of my favorite examples is in Germany. If someone were to ask you how you were doing in Germany, you would wonder why they did that. They're not your friend. They don't know you. You're just looking for what is the transaction in a store. So the customer experience is quite different in Germany, and the airport needed to get a good feel for who was traveling through the airport and what were their expectations in terms of the customer experience so they could meet or exceed those expectations. And I'll definitely explain the consequences of that in just 1 minute. Another strategic initiative that the airport was involved in was in bringing in new airlines into the airport, and that would increase revenue in the airport. But to do that, it's a very complicated process that takes several years, and you're going to be working with executives from another country that you very well may not understand the culture very well. And that can lead to what are a number of problems. So what we help them do is something called a cultural risk analysis, in which we looked at the activities that the airlines would be involved in, and then we would see how culture might interrupt. And I'll give you a brief example. The Orlando International Airport was interested in getting direct flights to come in from Shanghai. Again, it's a very long process to be able to do that. And what we did is lay out all of the touch points where culture could impact this process. Starting from the very beginning, if you're going to be working internationally, you want to make sure that you are educating your executives on the difficulties that will come. When I am coaching executives, I usually let them know that international business is going to take 30% more time and 30% more money. It's going to be more difficult to be able to do. And you would want your executive team to know this because they will set their expectations based on your local culture. And that is the beginning of what we might do in this process. But we would need to be able to work with the contingent that was traveling to China to help them better understand how that they could build relationships, how they might be able to establish their credibility. There are rules to how you do a presentation in China, and they're very different than the norms of Western culture. A big one that I do a lot of work in is in negotiations, and negotiations in China look absolutely different than they do in Western culture. And what you find is if you get two groups together that don't understand negotiation styles and the goals of their counterparts, it gets very confusing and it starts to elevate stress and it starts to elevate what are negative emotions like frustration and anger. And it will make it very difficult to have a successful negotiation. We know that negotiations are 6 times more likely to be successful if you can build more rapport with your counterpart. And sadly, culture can get in the way of that. If you're not trained for it, if you don't understand the culture that you're working with. These are just some basic examples of things that might get in the way. There's many concrete things that can occur as well over the course of a couple of years. Just simple things like holidays. If you were trying to work with the Chinese counterpart during Spring Festival, it isn't going to work. The entire country shuts down and people travel home to see their families. So you need to be aware of what those holidays might be. So we would work with the airport to better understand all along this several year process of recruiting a new airport, what activities could be interrupted by culture, and we spent time preparing them to be able to work for that, to overcome those difficulties. So what are the real world consequences of helping an airport in this fashion? Well, one of the statistics that we were able to pull from the literature was that an international traveler on average spends $8 more a day than someone who is unhappy. And if you think about the math that I laid out in the beginning, there are about 800,000 people that go through the Orlando International Airport a day. And that means there's $300 million that can be gained if we can provide a positive customer experience for people that are traveling from other countries. That's not total revenue. That's just bonus revenue that is on top of the revenue that the airport is already making. So $300 million is a significant amount of revenue. And any executive would be quite interested in how they might be able to recoup that kind of money. So strategically quite important from an economic perspective. But not all strategic decisions are economic. There are some other decisions as well. And I'm going to talk about that in what is our next case, which is Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson is a huge company. If you brushed your teeth this morning or took a shower, you probably used a Johnson & Johnson product, or a subsidiary who makes products for Johnson & Johnson. They're global. They do more than $100 billion in revenue a year. So massive, massive company. How did they get so big? Well, one of the ways that Johnson & Johnson grows is by acquiring other companies. And they might acquire these companies for their technology. They might acquire them for their talent. They might acquire them for their intellectual property. But what they have to be able to do is integrate the companies quite quickly, or the shareholders will not receive the value of that acquisition. And these acquisitions are huge. The most recent one that we worked on was a $14 billion acquisition. So if it fails, there's a tremendous cost to the failure of the acquisition and integration of these companies. Now, there are a lot of reasons why that's important, but I'm going to tell you about a personal reason that affected me quite deeply. In 2019, I died. I had a stroke, and part of my heart broke off and went up an artery and hit me in the brain, and that was it. My life was over. I was very lucky. I had good medical care. They were able to resuscitate me, and after a couple of heart surgeries and a long recovery, I was fine, and I'm 100% recovered now. Uh, it was a traumatic experience. It was so painful. That's what I remember is the amount of pain that I went through when I was getting these surgeries. Just the slightest touch brought on immense amounts of pain. Roughly 1 year later, my dad died. It was very, very traumatic for my family. I'm still not quite over it. I don't think I'll ever be over it. The pain and suffering that my family went through, I can't begin to describe. Shortly after that, the world started to die. COVID hit. And there are some statistics that would say roughly 17 million people died from exposure to the COVID virus. Horrible deaths where they would be separated from their families and they wouldn't even be able to say goodbye. So, strategy isn't always about money. Sometimes it's about more important things like life and pain and suffering. And if we don't prepare our leaders to be thinking strategically about cultural competence, well, then these things will keep happening. And that's just a cost that we can't bear as a human species. So why am I telling you about this? Why do I talk about these health concerns? Well, one of the things that I found when we were working with Johnson and Johnson is an executive told me that because they were having difficulties with diversity and culture in one of their integrations, a medical device that could save lives was delayed by 1 year. So of course there was a huge economic cost to that, but there was also the cost that I just talked about, pain and suffering and loss of life that would occur. So from a real world perspective, we need to broaden, the thoughts of what is strategy and what are the outcomes that we're seeking, far past just economic outcomes, which is where most of the literature will focus. When they talk about failures in international joint ventures, it's always economic. But as you know, there are larger costs to failures that happen internationally. And we need to be thinking about that from a strategic perspective. The most recent work that we're doing is extending the work that we've been doing with Johnson and Johnson with other multinationals. And I'm sorry I can't mention them today. Some of these acquisitions aren't over yet, so the companies are quite sensitive, so I've got to protect the information. But you know these companies. They're quite large. They're quite large. Now, when we were working with Johnson and Johnson to help integrate companies that were being acquired from abroad, it's a very labor-intensive process. So it involved a lot of interviews, a lot of surveying, a lot of data analysis. And those projects might last anywhere from 8 months to a year to be able to pull off the project. Well, one of the things that we learned very quickly is that's just too much time. It takes too much time to do that. So we started looking for what were more advanced analytical techniques to be able to gather this cultural information. And what we have been able to do is put together a artificial and intelligent platform that can pull publicly available data and give us an analysis very rapidly. In many cases in less than a week, rather than 1 year. And that gives the executives of the company the information that they need to make decisions about these acquisitions, whether that would be in the targeting phase, whether that would be in a post-acquisition integration, all along the M&A process. They would have an understanding of these cultural values that may be problematic. Not all cultural values or disconnects in cultural values are problematic, but many of them are. Many of them can lead to these kinds of misunderstandings. And in effect, what we're trying to train the leaders to be able to do is see over the horizon. If they're able to see the future and have a better understanding of their counterparts that they're going to be working with to try to solve problems, they can put initiatives in place that may be able to better address some of these cultural differences. Yes, training might be a solution, but there are many, many solutions. And to be effective, they need to be tied to the strategy of the organization. So if we're able to see over the horizon, we're then better able to adapt those initiatives to the situation. Because as you all know, no plan survives first contact. All plans are wrong when we have international initiatives, even domestic initiatives. Our planning fails many, many times. We adjust, and that's how good business is done. But you can adjust better if you can see farther out. And to do that, you need to have a strategic view of culture rather than what is just the tactical view of culture. If we do that, we can come back to the time where we all speak with one voice, and we can build towers that we'll be proud of, that will last for a very long time, and ultimately be a symbol of our success. So with that, I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions that I may be able to answer. Thank you.
Так.
Dear
Дякуємо,
Professor,
дякуємо, шановний пане Гріфіту, за такий багатогранну вашу доповідь. І, шановні колеги, будь ласка, ми декілька вийшли з таймінгу нашого пленарного засідання, тому зараз одне дуже коротеньке питання до пана Гріфіта, і тоді вже всі питання ми задаємо у чаті. Будь ласка, Тетяна Іванівна.
Дякую. Thank you so much.
Dear Professor Griffith, we would like to thank you for your comprehensive presentation, very interesting report. Thank you very much. Now, please, would you be so kind to answer a question to you, and please also answer questions in the chat. We thank you very much in advance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Griffiths. I'm possess such deep, interesting, and such visualized report as you do always. I'm delighted to have a scientific discussion on cross-cultural issues with you on our stage. And my short question may be a little bit provocated. Can strategic management remain scientifically valid and practically effective if it continues to ignore the transformative impact of cultural differences on organizational behavior and decision-making logic? Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you so much. It's good to see you, my friend. And to answer your question, could it remain valid? Well, I think there's two ways to look at this issue. One is that from a scientific perspective, I think it's deficient when we don't address what are important variables. So if we think about it from a science perspective, the model of strategic management that we have put together isn't the correct model. It's missing some things. And what that means in the real world is that it won't be as effective as it could be. So for us to come up with what is a properly specified model I absolutely would say that we need to think about the impact of culture, national culture, as well as organizational culture, because that is going to be impacted by the national culture. And luckily, what we are seeing is that some researchers are beginning to have this conversation. The shortcomings from a scientific perspective, I think, are in measurement. Culture is not measured well in the scientific research that is being done. This will be a very unpopular statement to say, but many people will use sort of big values approaches to measuring culture. For instance, the Hofstede dimensions. And using those dimensions in a scientific endeavor is like using a sledgehammer to try to do dentistry. You can do it, but it's sloppy. And we need more precise measurement. And it will be difficult to do, but it can be done. So I do believe that from a scientific perspective, what we need to do is incorporate culture into our research questions. We need to measure it well, and then we need to continue doing that research, even though it's difficult to do, and it's expensive to do. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that would be my thoughts on it.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome.
Дякую. Дякую щиро, шановний пане Гріфіс. І, будь ласка, віддайте нам екранчик для того, щоб ми могли завантажити наступну презентацію.
Dear Professor, can you give us the screen in order to switch on the next presentation? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I will go into the chat and answer some questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
А ми переходимо до наступного доповідача. До виступу запрошується пан Руй Мендес, директор з міжнародних зв'язків Вищого технічного інституту Лісабонський університет та член муніципального парламенту міста Кашкайш, Португалія. Будь ласка, шановний колего.
And now we proceed to the next speaker. We give the floor to Rui Mendes, Director of International Affairs at Higher Technical Institute, the University of Lisbon, and a member of the Cascais Municipal Parliament, Portugal. So, dear colleagues, please, the floor is yours. We cannot hear you, please.
Може, потрібна... Ні? Дякую.
Okay, now it's done.
Okay, we can hear you. Thank you. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning. I think it's good morning still to everyone. So I'd like to start by greeting, of course, all participants, especially the members of our FIT project that are here today, because it's an important project that speaks about important things like this academic freedom and inclusion on the digital. So it's a hot topic, and it's true for sure that it's a pleasure to join to this specific annual International Scientific Conference, Economic Development and Legacy by Simon Kuznets. So thank you very much again for that. So as you know, all these institutions, companies, communities are increasing and rely on data to make decisions. So the data are fundamental in our lives. So we face with this a crucial question. How can we ensure that digital transformation serves the people? For sure, and not the other way around. So this is important. Privacy, because we are talking about privacy also here, and about privacy and trust and learning analytics. So privacy is not merely a technical issue. It's a kind of social contract between citizens and institutions. So means responsibility, means also transparency, means accountability, and means respect for individual rights. And inclusion reminds us that digital progress is meaningful only when it leaves no one behind. Because regardless of the age, the gender, the background, ability, everything, it's included on this specific matter, and it's important to respect this according to the different levels of freedom of everyone. So today's discussion is not, of course, only about technology, but is about ethics, about fairness, about a human dimension on this digital innovation. I hope I can clarify a little bit what is important to mention on that, because rather than barriers, we need to think in a truly inclusive digital future. So let's see what is the context of this presentation. So first of all, and let me just put here a little bit different, okay? First of all, learning analytics refers to the collection and analysis of student data, because now we are focused on our education, we are focused on the specific connection with students to improve learning and teaching. For sure, it's used for progress monitoring, for sure, because it's important to guarantee that all the data is there concerning all the elements about the learning and teaching. Adaptive learning, because we know that we are in a faster world, and for sure the things are moving faster, and we need to have these ITs prepared for this adaptive learning. So early alerts, because the information now is crucial to take decisions, and for sure, if we have these warnings during our process of moving and changing data, we can be more efficient on that. And evidence-based decision making, because if you have good decisions, if you are respecting all this part of the learning analytics, of course you can do the practical good strategies for our institutions. So third one, this is the emerging field with both great potential. So because we are talking about ethical challenges, and we need to speak on this part of the regulatory aspects that the GDPR and data protection that comes up mainly in Europe. So this is important to have this background, this context for the presentation. So let's take the opportunities of this learning analytics. So in terms of risks, of course, there is a big risk when we are just having these systems that shows information to the audiences, to different communities. So is erosion of the trust if privacy is mishandled. So this is the question. This is important to guarantee that everything is based on a trustful system when you are using that. So there is some bias in algorithms, because you know that learning analytics is based in algorithms. These algorithms must be checked, must be verified, must be monitored. And there is a kind of over-surveillance and profiling of this, because there is a risk that all of this, it's too much when we are just looking to the information of the others. But we have also opportunities, not only risks on learning analytics. We have also institutional improvement and efficiency, because the people have all the information in the same place and they can access and take decisions. Early identification of students at risk, because if you are using an algorithm, it's more easy to know what is the trend of the specific student according to the specific variables and characteristics of the students, and because we can obtain personalized feedback and improve it, of course, the retention if you have this feedback. And this is the questions between the risks and the opportunities. Sometimes we have this balance that shows that we need to decide something, which is good, but in fact, we have these risks according to our decisions. So this regulatory framework, like the GDPR, so the data protection in Europe, as you know. So we have this data protection regulation and sets the foundation for privacy, transparency, and user control. This is very fundamental. So we have three different dimensions here. The core principles, what we have here, lawfulness. So there is a set of regulations that you need to respect, and they are very tricky to respect everyone, because there is a lot of them that are interacting, and new regulations that are based in a regular basis that we can access. The fairness, the purpose limitation, the minimization, important to use and to show only the information that cannot put in risk, of course, the personal identification of the person, of the institution, etc. Accuracy, integrity, confidentiality, and accountability. So all these principles are important for this general data protection regulation. But we have also the legal basis for processing, the consent, because the people must consent if they want to have your data available for the others. The contract, because in some of these parts, in mainly between companies or between institutions or between projects, when we are just designing with different partners, we need to have some legal contract clauses that defends this GDPR. public interest because you need to show only information that is for sure important and interesting for the public, because otherwise it's not an information that we can just show to the others. And for course, to be a legitimate interest when we are just giving this information. So, and we have also the rights. So the right to access to the information. So if you are, imagine, to apply to a contest in a university, you have the access to, you have the right to access to the information about the other candidates of this contest. So this is one of the rules of the GDPR. So the erasure, the portability is important. The portability, because of course you can just do this in the different ways. If you are just finalizing, imagine a contract with a mobile phone provider, we can just have this possibility, we have the portability, and they cannot deny this possibility, but defending again our rights in terms of the data protection access. And objection, because the person can just, if they decide, if they want, they can decide to delete the data in some institutions, in some conditions. Of course, there is some regulations, national regulations, where the data is really providing the information. This is mandatory. And in these cases, the law defines and determines what it's needed to guarantee this is mandatory. So to respect, of course, the rights of the persons. So this is just an example, and you can see just in Portugal, there is one national commission for data protection. This is based on this same institution, but based in Europe, and there is a kind of evaluation of the behavior of the different institutions, and here is the case of Portugal. And in Portugal, you can see the first case here, the Portuguese National Statistical Institute, that they not match here on a specific thing with the non-compliance with general data processing principle. So what they did here, so or what they don't did here. So they forgot here to create a specific structure in the institution that guarantee that the data has some privacy in internal terms and external terms. So, and you can see that it was a fine of more than 4 million euros. So just a single step, this is just to have a structure in the institution that can just guarantee the safety of the information, wasn't did by this Portuguese National Institute, and of course they have some fines by the authorities. Or here in the Lisbon City Council, because we have insufficient legal basis for data processing. So there was a manifestation in the streets with some people from some nationalities, but they didn't respect the anonymous information of the people, and they spread the information across the media, and they were fined in more than 1 million euros. So it's important to take care about this, because in the future, because we have this spread by some countries in Europe, but in the future, of course, more of these countries around the world will respect and use this kind of regulations. So, but let's see now in the case of University of Lisbon, because I'm University of Lisbon, IST is the School of Engineering of University of Lisbon, and we have a specific ecosystem. So this ecosystem is based on a governance framework. And we had to design this governance of the GDPR, we had the support of some private companies, here the PricewaterhouseCoopers, and one legal company is CCR Legal. So they support us to design the level of maturity of our GDPR in University of Lisbon. But for that, because it's mandatory according to the rules in European level, to have a data protection officer. So you need to have it, otherwise you'll be fined. And if you have a data protection officer, and we have it in the context of University of Lisbon, each school has a data privacy team, because this data privacy team needs to collect and to know if the information are being used in a better way. But for that, for sure, because the people don't has all the learning process assumed in terms of the data protection. So there is some internal trainings that we developed here in privacy and also in ethical data. This was very important to guarantee that the mean of the use of the data are being spread around all the institution. And of course, there is some cybersecurity measures, and there is in Portugal, for instance, there is one institution, this is delivering this kind of trainings just on that to prevent that when we are using a computer, when we are using information on the web, we just prevent some incidents, because we are maybe to open some conditions to other person outside can access to our information in our institution just because we are using internet. And it's important that we can guarantee that all the tips that we can use to face these cybersecurity measures can be done in our institutions. And of course, there is a policy alignment between the school and the university that ensures the consistency of the information. And how? Because we have a kind of data protection catalog where we have mapping all the process for the university, all the schools, and there is a person responsible for each process. This person is responsible for all the data privacy on each process. For process, you can understand like the admission of a student, the process of admission of a student. This is a process. So there is a person that is responsible for that. So there are questions very important. This is a model that we use it in our ecosystem. You can see here the different privacy initiatives. Is in Portuguese, but here I try to I just translate the question. So there is a set of dimensions that we are analyzing here to detect this level of maturity of our institutions. So governance structure, privacy strategy, privacy policy, trainings, data subject rights, privacy communication, privacy risk and management model, personal data processing catalog, the catalog that I mentioned, data quality, relationship model. So there is a lot of things this is important to mention when we are looking for the data. It's not only for the infrastructure, the technology infrastructure. So we need to see all the other dimensions, which means that when we are analyzing in the first time, they just discover that we had a kind of moderate maturity. Of course, with a specific goal to have a high maturity in terms of GDPR. So gaps, there is important to mention that if you have an incident, a data breach in our institution, we need to have a kind of reporting this incident. This is mandatory by law. We have just 48 hours to do it. And for that, you need to design a process in your institution. So to have some maturity on your institution, you need to do some steps in order to. So, but how to connect all these things to guarantee that we are making and respecting the inclusion and accessibility. So integration of accessibility and inclusion in quality assurance systems. So it's fundamental, is important when we are just checking, evaluating, monitoring our quality assurance in different dimensions. We are just ensuring that accessibility and inclusion are there. So emphasis on universal design and equal access to digital learning. So we have different models. We have one specific initiative, this is Sartre, where we have just giving all the tools and instruments to the professors to guarantee that the access is equal for everyone. So ethical use of learning analytics, so anonymization, I already spoke about this, and pseudo-anonymization, what is this? So we can just use it, not the real names, but some fake names that can just ensure that we are there. It's possible to identify the person itself, but not the others that are seeing the information. Institutional accountability through DPOs, so data protector officers. Audits and privacy training. I already mentioned the trainings. And to have a transparent communication to build student trust. So the students must know that their information are really secure and they have all the conditions to proceed with all the activities in university without having any risk with this information. So we have 3 showcases here. One is the Recovery and Resilience Program that the European Commission just demanded. But for that, there is some conditions and boundaries according this trust in the information. So they define legal and procedural framework for handling personal data with this plan. They emphasize here on accountability. So they will check if everything is going to the main objective of this plan or this action, some transparency because we have a kind of dashboard where it's possible to see where is in this time, in a real time, where is this project, and risk-based governance of data, because when you are analyzing data and they are important data, we need to have this risk management for this data. So mandates, privacy notices, informed consent, data protection clauses, everything is there on the agreements made by the government, by the institution that received the money for this plan, and of course the European Commission. So relevant for us, it's we have learning analytics and monitoring systems under this plan just to comply with GDPR. We have this catalog, we have these conditions in all the software and IT systems that guarantee that we are respecting this in a way equitable and ethical data use. So, but we have also a showcase tool. So how to protect the data in scientific research. So it's another topic that we can just speak all the morning, but defines how to process personal, pseudo-anonymized and anonymous data in research context. So establish researchers' responsibility. So we have data controllers for each process. That means that the researchers knows the responsibilities. We have processors, people that are doing, and joint controllers. All these persons are there under the process just to respect this. Requires this pseudo-anonymization. We have a secure storage, because if you have a data breach in your institution, you need to formulate immediately a report about the technical issue, and you need to deliver this to your Protection Data Commission, National Commission. And minimization too of personal identifiers. If you have, again, this data breach, if you are minimizing the risks, of course, the information could be spread by an error, for sure, by a mistake, by an access that will not be possible. But because we have these policies, we guarantee that the risks are not so high. So this reinforces, of course, the constant collection, because the people need to agree with this information. And when they decide to delete the information, we must be able to delete this information and to clean all the aspects related with this information. So this promotes research into integrity, because it's one of the big mottos that we are discussing in research in Europe, and the trust also through ethical handling of participant information. So, but we have a third showcase. This is artificial intelligence, for sure, because everyone is speaking about artificial intelligence. Of course, this applies to all AI systems processing personal data within our university. But we need to require a data protection impact assessment. So there is a report based on the tools that we are using about artificial intelligence, and we need to measure these risks and to have a report about that with all the elements there. This ensures the compliance with the GDPR principles, mainly the accuracy, the minimization and fairness, and prohibits fully automated decision-making without human oversight. So if you are using AI, you need to control this with a human touch to prevent this fully automated decision-making. So mandates bias monitoring and documentation to prevent discrimination, for sure, and ensures responsible and inclusive use of AI in learning, analytics, and digital education. So just to end the presentation, so what we can just say about the connection between these three topics: trust, transparency, and digital inclusion. So trust built through transparency and participation, because all the persons are important. Who is controlling the information, who is delivering the information, we have the own data that are providing to the institution. So everything is based on a trustable system. Students must know what data are collected, why and how use it. So for that, you need to have transparent decisions, transparent systems, transparent structures, and the students must be relieved when they are accessing to the information. Provide opt-out mechanisms if they want to go out, and clear privacy dashboards. Not only dashboards, but also statements. It's important to have there very clear, because it's proof that your institution are following this. In inclusion, accessible tools and digital literacy support will reduce, for sure, the barriers. And for sure, this inclusion means also that we need to prevent and to defend these personal characteristics of each person. Fairness by design prevents also bias and reinforces the equality of opportunity. So this is in fact just one of the most topics that we are lots of topics, wider topics that we can just speak about that. I hope this will be useful for you. I'm of course open to different questions, and thank you very much for your attention. I can just also answer in the chat if you have any other questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Ми дякуємо нашому доповідачеві. Дуже класна, дуже цікава доповідь. І, мабуть, з-за того, що у нас дуже цікаві сьогодні доповіді і багато запитань, ми трошки виходимо з таймінгу. Тому, колеги, дуже прошу, виключно одне питання наживо і всі інші питання до доповідача в чат. Прошу.
Dear Mr. Mendes, thank you very much for your great speech and comprehensive report. Dear colleagues, please, only one question to our distinguished speaker. Because we are just a moment, we are exceeding the time limit of our plenary session because of very interesting reports on really topical issues which concern everyone. So please, dear colleague, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yulia Dobroskok, head of International Relations Office, and I'm also the team member of this project. But the question is, what is the biggest challenge for your university in ensuring ethical and GDPR compliant using of learning data of the students? So from your perspective and from your experience, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I have all the pleasure to answer. So for sure, there is lots of challenges here. The first challenge is that for some of the conditions, the boundary conditions of our activity, we need to respect the GDPR, not only to avoid this finance that I mentioned, but also that in some principles for apply to applications to funding for the government, you need to prove that you are having this kind of entities in your institution. So this is the second challenge that we need to prepare in our institution. The third one is that because we have a society very demanding, the persons are very demanding in all the matters. So all the persons are just arguing about everything in the society nowadays. And for that, you need to have a powerful system in your institution that guarantee if anyone has some requests, if anyone has some doubt, if anyone has some problem that he's facing or the institution when you are concerning the use of the information, we are prepared to, of course, to answer immediately on this basis. And the fourth challenge is how to change our IT systems to respond to this in an efficient way. So it's not easy because, again, so for this protection, National Commission for Data Protection, so we need to report if we have a data breach in 48 hours. And this is a technical report that must be very well done and prove where we have the data breach and all the conditions and boundaries that we have that defends eventually the anonymization of the information. And this is another challenge. Finally, the fifth challenge is they are the persons, for sure. Persons matters, as you know. And for the persons, they must be prepared, and not only the data protection officer, not only the person that is the owner of the process, but all the community, because data is a common responsibility. And to train the people to be used to these topics, you need to have a lot of trainings, you need to have a lot of sensitive actions, and for sure, you need to have a kind of a kind of strategic approach in your boards, because if the board is not believing on that, nothing will happen. And it's done. Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. So the challenge is students, staff, the board, and society. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Дякуємо, колеги, за дискусію. А ми продовжуємо роботу конференції. Олена Валентинівна, прошу.
Шановні колеги, ми переходимо до заключної доповіді нашого пленарного засідання. Слово надається пану Раму Дамодарану, заступнику постійного спостерігача Міжнародного комітету миру при Організації Об'єднаних Націй США. Шановний колега, запрошуємо вас до виступу.
So, and now the floor is given to Ramo Damodaran, Deputy Permanent Observer of the Intergovernmental University for Peace to the United Nations, the United States of America. So, Mr. Damodaran, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for your warm welcome. I've really had a most stirring and enjoyable half an hour to an hour listening to the distinguished speakers before me, Mr. Rui Mendes, and his fascinating discussion, if you will, about confidentiality and privacy in an age of economic, political, and strategic cooperation. I think it's an important lesson that we derive from that, because one of the questions that I would like to ask in the course of our conversation this afternoon is whether it is possible for an institution like the United Nations to work and realize its mission when everything that happens within its corridors, even private conversations, are not subject to that privacy and confidentiality. Everything is out in the open. And of course, I was so moved by my old and cherished friend, Rich Griffith, to listen to him and also to have an idea, if you will, of pain, the idea of how pain becomes a factor in the United Nations. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if my camera, can you see me now? Yeah, that's better. Now, I would like to begin this by the question that we posed in the title of this: what is it that the founders of the United Nations hoped for? And when the United Nations started in 1945, we had 51 countries who assembled in San Francisco to try and draw up the structure and the opportunities for the organization. Ukraine was one of them and went on to become a full-fledged member of the United Nations. But the one element I think was lacking, the element that Rich Griffith brought out so beautifully, the idea of pain. Because it was almost as if all that had happened in the Second World War was behind us, and that there was no particular reason to try and relive that past, or even to try and make sure that past did not recur. The idea was always towards the future. And so you created what might be called in many ways a painless organization, an organization full of structures, full of rules, of regulations and procedures, but an organization which was created in the remarkable spell of just 6 weeks. And it is true that as a contingency, the designers of the United Nations did put a proviso that 10 years after the organization came into being, there would be what is called a Charter Review Conference. That is enshrined in Article 109 of the Charter, where nations would get together and look at the Charter and see how far it had served its original purpose, and possibly come up with ideas of amending it or making it more relevant to the time. Now, that conference was supposed to take place in 1955. We are now 70 years later in 2025. The conference has not taken place, and it's unlikely to ever take place, precisely because so few nations want to unravel and reopen the Charter. So what we are left with is really to make the best, and it's not difficult to do, to make the best of the United Nations at a time when what is more important is not the structures and mechanism of its voting or its procedures, but really a United Nations that can become a lightning rod to the world, where creative minds get together and come to the organization and share their ideas. And this, of course, immediately touches upon Professor Rui Mendes' idea of confidentiality and privacy, because when you talk about ideas like intellectual property or discovery, you are very loath to put them in the public domain, because those who discovered them, those who have either created a patent for them or a copyright for them, want to possess it and be given the credit for it. And so what really remains for us is to see how the United Nations can best take advantage of the enormous capacities that the world has before it, and yet recognize human flourishing in the sense of what individuals do and what individual nations do. And I can frankly think of no member of the United Nations more appropriate for this consideration than Ukraine. Look at the vastness of Ukraine's history in terms of human flourishing, in terms of the ideas of individuals that made a difference. Look at technology. Look at defense or protective equipment. Look at Igor Sikorsky and his invention, if you will, of the helicopter. Look at the discovery of the Trika submarine, the electric tram. the rocket engine that went into space devised by Sergei Korolev. And then you come into the areas of health and medicine, the X-ray tube discovered by Ivan Puluj, the idea of being responsible for the environment, the ecological car fuel, which was made from wood waste by Volodymyr Melnikov, the moving hives for bees, nurturing an entire population and resource for honey, which was modeled by Petro Prokopovich. Entertainment, the original disc player, the precursor of what we call the compact disc, by Vyacheslav Petrov. The cinematograph by Joseph Timchenko. And then you come into the fields of public health and medicine. Krunia Sukarieva, who worked pioneeringly on autism. Vladimir Havkine, who devised the vaccines for cholera and plague. Now, I've suggested these names to show that this rich and abundant talent must be integrated into the United Nations we know. Because this is going to be an organization not only preoccupied, and it has to be preoccupied, with ideas of war and peace, but also the idea of creating a world of beauty, of sympathy, and of achievement. And much of this rests on the one question which I think we have not sufficiently been able to address at the United Nations, that of technology. A couple of weeks ago, the Nobel Prize in Economics for the year 2025 was awarded. And the premise of the award was that 3 scholars had created what was described as the foundations of an innovation-driven economic growth. The idea of technological progress, the idea of creative destruction. And when we pictured what that mirrored, how these minds were able to harmonize technology with the global economic landscape, it resonated so well with a thought of the great Simon Kuznets, who spoke about the mass application of technological innovation, which constitutes much of the distinctive substance of modern economic growth, and it being closely connected with further progress of science in its basis for additional advance in technology. So you have this synchronicity, even though there are years that separate them, between Simon Kuznets and the Nobel Prize this year, and the question of how do we actually seize this opportunity. Dr. Ponomarenko has spoken about the need for Ukraine to localize and respond to the impact of global crises on the national economy. Because you cannot be insulated from what is happening in the world outside. But what I'm trying to suggest is that that insulation is not just an insulation from dangers, but could also unwittingly be an insulation from creativity and hope. My good friend, Tatiana Lepievko, has authored a paper along with other friends of mine, Andrea Zahetna and Daniela Zahetna and Oksana Mazurenko, which speaks of leadership, of cultural nuance, about leadership adapting to the life cycle of an organization. And that also is a phrase I would ask you to keep in mind. Because if technology can work within the United Nations, if those who are able to further technology can use the United Nations as a platform to reach the 8 billion people on the planet, then you have created a leadership. So this ultimately is what the United Nations 80 years after its inception is all about. The compulsion to be a leader in fields that can make a human difference. And this will naturally be more slow, more measured. It will not be like a response to conflict or war, which has to be immediate. Because this is really understanding that you have an organization which has so many potentials within it that it cannot afford to exclude the greatest potential of all, the potential all of you represent, the potential of scholarship. And so I would invite you to think about this, to try and see whether, as individuals, as educators, as scientists, you can work for a United Nations which promotes and advances human flourishing, or whether you can also create an organization completely true to what was needed in 1945, but bringing it to the residents of our times. Now, today, the 16th of October, is World Food Day. And why do I think of that? Because it's again something we take so much for granted. Very few of us in this room today, in this conference today, are in a situation where we have to worry about where food comes. But think of food as a basis for the creation of the United Nations. Think of the ravaging Holodomor, which took place in Ukraine at the very time of the Second World War, and how that fed into the creation of the organization. Think also of the fact that food is ultimately the most intimate idea of nourishment. It is something you crave according to the needs of your body, of your mind, and your tongue. You think of this wonderful designation that was made 3 years ago in 2022, when UNESCO declared Ukrainian borscht to be an intangible cultural achievement of mankind, and the need to safeguard its purity. And I always like to think also about the other field in which we are engaged together, the field of education. Who was it who proposed that education should be in the Charter of the United Nations as a goal for nations to work together? That proposal came in 1945 from the president of a farmers' bureau in Utah in the United States. And it completely dispelled the myth that all that farmers think about is crops and food and insecticides and so on, and created an opportunity for realizing that farmers too felt that education is the most powerful instrument you can use to change the world. So finally, in trying to wrap all this together, the thought I would like to leave you with is, can we think of a new forum in the United Nations where the best scientific and technological and academic minds get together and come into the United Nations, into its halls, or even meet as we are doing online and Zoom or whatever, and talk about possibilities? If we had not talked about possibilities, where would all those wondrous achievements and discoveries and inventions for which Ukraine is famous be known? It's very difficult to try and fully understand that we are now in an age of what I would call the post-liberated human being. For much of the 20th century, human beings were concerned with liberating themselves through a process that was not within their power to control. It was the actions of their governments or other governments. It was forces of nature. We've had reference in our conversation this morning to the way the world was transformed with COVID in 2020. But we now have an opportunity where you take a particular economic or social problem and come to the United Nations with solutions at three levels. Admittedly, at the political level, which means that you either create an organization or you create the mechanics for cooperation. It also means that you allow the larger entity of the United Nations to subdivide itself to smaller regional groupings and avenues. And finally, it also means that you bring into the discussion those individuals who are able to contribute meaningfully to the discussion. Many years ago, one of the greatest poets of our time, Taras Shevchenko, wrote, and maybe I shouldn't try my Ukrainian on you, but let me give it an attempt. Жаліво бути в кайданах помирати, в полоні алеже гірше бути вільним спати. And if I didn't get that right, please forgive me, but let me give you the English translation. It is horrible to die in chains, to die in captivity. It is worse to be free and asleep. That is what Taras Shevchenko warned us about. You can create political liberation, you can create strategic liberation, but if you are liberated and asleep to the needs of the world in which you are born and in which you will spend your life, then you are no better off than that human being in captivity and chains. And what I found most powerful also about that quote is that it refers to the most intimate part of our existence each day, the moment we fall asleep. The only thing we have when we sleep between ourselves and the world outside us is possibly our mind, our dreams, but everything around it, the degree of comfort that your blanket and pillow provide, the degree of rest that silence around you allows, all of that is part of the great intimacy which we must now make into a common heritage of mankind. It is not
Dear Mr. Пане Рамадан, у нас зараз скоро почнеться робота секцій, і тому я пропоную наступне, щоб не перебивати вас, до вас ще є питання. Ми могли б зараз перейти до питань і залишитися в пленарному засіданні ті, хто мають продовжувати спілкуватися з паном спікером. Дякую.
Dear Mr. Damodaran, we are very thankful to you for your really fascinating speech and interesting presentation. I think you will be objective, and we beg your pardon for this some sort of an interruption. But unfortunately, we are exceeding our time limit of our conference and plenary session. We are supposed to have a break now. Again, thank you very much. Again, we are very sorry. We have a question to you. So would you be so kind to answer this oral question and also the questions in the chat? Thank you very much.
Будь ласка, пані Істринська, питання.
Good day, Mr. Damodaran and all participants. I have a little question for you. What problems do you see in the United Nations activities in today's reality? Thank you.
I wouldn't know where to begin or where to stop, because my conviction is that any problem you take that affects our lives as women and men and children is a measure of the failure of the United Nations in that area. I'm being very, very candid about it. If the United Nations had been all that its founders designed 80 years ago, you would certainly not have war, conflict, deprivation, hunger, all of these. But what I'm trying to suggest, and I'd really like to leave you thinking about this, is that it is not something for the United Nations as a political organization to come up with solutions with. It is the United Nations as the creative forum where thinking minds of scientific expertise, of technological expertise, of medical expertise can come and share problems. And we've done this. We've talked about COVID. We've talked about vaccines, which were not thought of in 2019, which suddenly came to the world scene in 2020. So it's not beyond us. But every individual, like you, madam, like all of us in this room today, must be convinced that the way to change the world is to apply human intellect to a political organization.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. Good day.
Thank you.
Щиро дякуємо ще раз, пане Дамодаран, за вашу доповідь. І перепрошуємо, що у нас такі стислі рамки часові. Дякуємо ще раз за доповідь.
Thank you, Mr. Damodaran. Unfortunately, again, time limits, we are not allowed to exceed them, and we have done it already. Again, thank you very much. Thank you.
Шановні колеги, шановні наші спікери, шановні гості, які присутні зараз з нами тут поруч у нашій безпечній локації на базі Харківського національного економічного університету імені Семена Кузнеця, всі, хто приєднався до нас до пленарного засідання онлайн. Безмежна подяка за участь, за дуже класну дискусію, за цікаві доповіді. На цьому ми пленарне засідання нашої конференції завершуємо. Зараз у нас майже 5-хвилинна перерва, і ми відповідно до програми конференції розпочинаємо о 13:00 за київським часом роботу секційних засідань. Нагадуємо, що відповідно до вашої реєстрації ви отримали посилання, і за цими посиланнями можна і необхідно зайти і приєднатися до роботи секцій. У вас також є можливість взяти участь у роботі інших секцій, оскільки було розіслано вам і інші посилання. Оголошуємо перерву. Всім дякуємо за участь у пленарному засіданні. Продовжуємо роботу секції.
Dear colleagues, both who joined us in an offline format and offline in our secure location, we are very grateful to your great reports, interesting presentations, to your contributions, to your participation in our conference. Thank you very much. So, and now, dear colleagues, the plenary session of our conference is over. We will take a break now, and in accordance with the conference program, the work in breakout sessions will would start at 1 p.m. Kyiv, that is Ukrainian time. Would have started, but not now, unfortunately. Because we have exceeded a little bit time limits, but we hope to start this work at 1 p.m. So in proper time. And we remind you that you can join your session via an appropriate Zoom link according to your registration. You also have an opportunity to take part in the work of any session of the conference. The links have been sent to you. And now let us have a break. Thank you again.